Did you forget them? Do you want mine?
No, I just don't know.
I don't need them.
Does it work for reading?
Try it. I have an astigmatism. I don't know if you do.
It's all right, I'll hold it out.
I do
Okay.
have reading glasses.
Yeah,
I'm gonna try them.
sure.
Are we on?
And the next color?
I want to welcome you all here this evening. Thanks, thank you to the board. Thank you to over 100 individuals right now who are connecting with us live stream. So I welcome you to the meeting as well. I'd like to call the meeting to order. If we could stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We have a couple items of regular business before we get into the presentation on the reopening plan, which is why, that's the big why we're all here to listen to. I just want to make a couple of comments first. I know this has been a long process. There has been a great deal of uncertainty, concern. It has been frustrating at times, and there's anxiety out there. We acknowledge that, and that applies among students, families, and staff. But we really have no alternative but to continue to work through the situation, to deal with the factors that we're confronted with, to deal with the uncertainty that we're confronted with, and as a community to come to resolution. We know that the RSU1 community is committed to education. We will persevere. As one of our commenters tonight said, one of the public comments we received, the individual said, we have to show our resilience. This is going to test us all, but we are resilient, and we will come out with an outcome that works for the RSU1 community. First, and I'm sure Patrick might repeat this, I do want to thank the two committees that worked on the remote learning and the restart plan to get us back into the classroom. Those committees worked very hard. They were very diligent. I attended all the meetings. I was impressed with the participation that we had, and those committees were broadly representative of the community and students, teachers, parents, administrators. And I do want to thank those individuals for the time they put in. I also just want to note that the association's Teachers Association has been a very active participant in this process, and I want to thank them for that as well. So with that said, I just want to move on to item 3.0. And we have a resolution to authorize the $365,327 school revolving renovation fund loan with an estimated $188,536 principal forgiveness. So, Lou, would you make that motion for us?
Sure. Motion is, I move that the resolution entitled Resolution to Authorize $365,327 School Revolving Renovation Fund Loan with estimated $188,536 principal forgiveness be approved in form presented to this meeting, and that the Secretary file an attested copy of said resolution with the minutes of this meeting.
Thanks, Lou. Do we have a second?
A second.
Anita gives us a second. Okay, thanks. So we have a motion by Lou, second by Anita. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, all in favor, thanks very much. Okay, item 4.0, and I think.
I'm
this,
sorry, Steve, do we need to sign this before we leave?
Yeah, it would be helpful if we could, so we'll do it maybe at the break.
Yeah, okay.
I have the form here, we can use one.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Okay, item 4.0, we have the fall and reopening presentation, and I am going to turn that over to Patrick, Amy, and Dr. Hannah. If you will take questions from the board as we go along.
Yeah, I think our plan was to take questions from the board after we go through each section, and then, any questions at the end from the board, and then go through the public comment. So I think we'll dive right into it. Again, I don't want to, people want to get to the details of it, but I do want to start by thanking the people that have served on the various committees. We've had, our own staff, fire, police, EMS, parents, students. Dr. Hannah has been invaluable throughout this whole process, and also just Midcoast Hospital has always reached out to us and asked us what they can do to help us. So we really appreciate that, because we're in the business of education and not the health field, and we needed people to advise us and help us through this process. Thank the staff and the parents for your continued patience and support as we consider a tremendous amount of data in making this decision. And just please realize the situation is fluid. It can change, and there are many unknowns, and we do not have all of the answers. And as Steve alluded to, we just need to be flexible during this situation and try to be as supportive as we can of one another as we navigate through this tough process. So we plan to kind of go through each section of this, Katie and I and Dr. Hannah. And again, we'll stop, pause, and see what questions the board has. We're not going to go through it word by word, but just, our committee, we have a small committee, and then we made a larger committee that I think was very successful. Had a lot of conversations, a lot of back and forth. Thought we were going down the right path one time, and we had to back up. I mean, that happened several times. But the priorities for our model has been ensuring the health and safety of students and staff. And I think the obvious part of that is the COVID piece, when students and staff come back into the building. At the same time, a lot of our conversation had to do with the mental health and social interaction of students if they're not in school. The second one is providing the best possible education to every student, and that's from trying to balance them being in person, as well as the improvements we've made to the remote learning piece. And then the third lens that we look through is recognizing the importance of family and work schedules at the same time. So those were the three lenses that we tried to look through as we made recommendations and came to this process. Any questions you have on that piece? Kind of just an intro. Right.
Great. So next, we wanted to make sure through this whole process that we had input from our entire community. And we're so pleased with the outpouring of assistance we got from all kinds of fields, just as Patrick and Steve sort of reviewed. But just so everybody's clear and to review, we did have the distance learning committee. We also had school-based teacher planning committees during those 2 weeks in June before everybody left, so they could sort of review what had been found from the distance learning committee and also start to think through what a hybrid versus in-person versus total distance plan would look like at each of their buildings. And so we were able to sort of collect all of those notes, and then we have the Fall District Reopening Committee, which is the one that just met and will continue to meet after you all vote on whatever plan we have to make sure everybody feels that this is the safest way to move forward as things continue to change. We wanted to be really transparent with all of the results and the feedback from the 2 surveys, as well as everything that had been presented. And so staff, students, and families were surveyed before our June PD days, and then we recently surveyed just staff and families again, not students. And so all of that can be found on the live links here. And that actually informed a ton of where our discussion led throughout all of these different meetings, because we did have so many people sharing questions or comments that really made us think in different ways. So I just wanted to thank everybody again.
Any questions on committees? Okay. Next thing, just to review, is I think it's just known by most people, is just that the state put out a color-coded system, and that system is going to be updated every 2 weeks. So again, that goes back to that fluid piece of if Saginaw County were to have a big spike, it could change what we're not directed to do, but kind of advised to do, possibly. So just red suggests that the county has a high risk of COVID-19 spread, and in-person instruction should not be conducted. Yellow suggests that the county has an elevated risk of COVID-19 and hybrid should be adopted. And then green suggests low 19 risk that can be adopted, although an SAU may opt for hybrid instruction if its building or readiness to adhere to the health and safety is a challenge. So as most people know, all counties in Maine last Friday were deemed green. And again, those are going to be updated every 2 weeks. I think, we struggled a little bit as a district about when we would come out with a specific plan. And, part of our conversation was, should we wait for this? We wanted to try to give some information to parents. And again, if our category changes, we may have to come back and our plans may have to change. But I just wanted people to be aware that every 2 weeks, so we'll be keeping a close eye on that. Questions you have on categorization?
Yeah, I have a question on the definition of community spread. I mean, that is not, maybe this is a question for you, Dr. Hanna. That's not limited to the school population. So that, for example, if there were an outbreak at EIW, for example, that might affect our green light, yellow light, red light distinction.
Right, yeah, so you're not looking at just the numbers in a school, you're really looking at what you have in your community that contributes to your school. So the parents, the grandparents, so everybody in the community. And I don't know what threshold they're using, how many people in Saginaw County or in our community have to be positive before they consider that community spread, but it is not just school related.
Yeah, because that's why I thought it was kind of puzzling that counties like Cumberland and Androscoggin, which CDC kept saying has community spread, they got a green light too. So I don't know what's it take before they say, oh, okay, it's a yellow light.
Right. I don't know if it's decreasing rates.
Yeah, maybe it's decreasing, which would be great.
I believe there is further information on the DOE website that actually walks through how they determine it. I didn't bring that print with me, but I know that if people did want to look into it, it does share more about how it was determined.
I think the point for me is that to make sure people, at least I think, understand that there are really two thresholds here. If we have an incidence of a case of infection within the school, a student, teacher, we may take an action to close that school. But we may also be required to take that action to close the school if like I said, if PIW shows up on someone's radar.
Okay, so this next portion, I think we'll take in a little bit more detail than the others. It's all of the health and safety expectations, and I'll walk through each of the bullet points, and then Dr. Hanna will actually speak towards the end in more depth about some of those, if that works, with some issues and factors that she's been really helpful in considering, and we know have already come up as community concerns. So again, these are from the Department of Education. These are requirements. These are not things that we are supposed to decide on our own. So they're being required for all of the public schools in Maine. And so we'll start with the symptom screening before coming to school. So this is that everybody does a self-check, staff and students alike, They do provide guidance for what that would look like. And so it's asking yourself a series of 4 questions. There could be a version we want to adopt that's a better version than this, or a different version. It doesn't have to be this one. I'm sure you have many ideas. But it asks things like, within the past 24 hours, have you had fever? Do you feel sick with any of the most common symptoms or any of the lesser ones? And the symptoms are all along the side. And then, have you been in contact with someone with COVID? And then, have you traveled outside of the state for the past 14 days? And essentially, if your answer to any of these questions, or you have 2 or more of the symptoms, you're supposed to stay home. And that's kind of the guidance. The DOE has not suggested, and so this is something for the board to talk about if you want, for us to do any sort of, I know we've talked about computerized systems or something where people have to log in and share that. So that portion is up to us. What they have required is that we go through and ensure that this occurs daily in people's minds and people's home conversations before they attend our buildings. And that we, on the other end, have a clear reporting system, both for just regular absences as well as a collection device for if someone does have any of these symptoms, who that person is, what the symptoms are, so we can make sure that we're carefully tracking, obviously following FERPA and whatnot, but ensuring that our nurses have a clear information about the incidence of this or just other illnesses in our community, more so than they ever have been. Because usually when people call out, they say, oh, so Kitty's sick today, and you don't necessarily go into why, what did they have, and so that protocol would need to be much more detailed. So I'll pause there so we can discuss. I'm assuming many of these will have questions, so maybe it's just easier to do that first. Does that make sense? Yes.
So I don't have the document in front of me, but does it include a question about your family, or is it just about the individual? So when someone's looking at answering these things, your self-check, is there any question about, does your mom and dad, does your brother and sister?
It asks if the person who you've been in contact with has COVID, not has any of these symptoms.
Is that,
right. So that should be part of it. So the question should be a question about, have you been exposed to COVID? Do you have family members who have, in my opinion, who have been tested for COVID or diagnosed with COVID? And then, the question about whether or not, you have family members with cold symptoms. I think, again, this is all just, we're trying to figure out who's at risk. And so the more information we can collect, the better.
Okay.
And I guess that would depend too on what age person you're asking this to. Like if you ask a young child, is mom and dad's sick or something, you might, oh yeah, they sneezed last night.
This is parents that are going to be doing this with kids.
Yeah. But the older kids would be answering this, wouldn't they?
At home before they
Yeah,
go to school.
Okay.
The self-assessment.
And I don't want to suggest we yell, but it would help if we kept our voices up a little bit. Maybe when you're speaking, a show of hands, because it might be difficult for folks by streaming to try to figure out who's talking. Any other, well, it's not my part of the presentation. I do have one other question. I have a question. Is other than self-finds, are there any ideas out there that might give us a better, somewhat better assurance that people are taking this self-examination process seriously?
I mean, the temperature checks have been, basically they've discouraged doing anything like that as far as when they come in the door. Our nurses are going to be much more vigilant as far as if somebody's demonstrating, a runny nose or a fever or anything like that, it's going to be a quick kind of action. But as far as, having our staff be at that front door and doing the self-checks or doing a temperature check, that hasn't been a recommendation by the Department of Education.
And the reason is that kids, about 50% of them won't even have a fever if they have COVID-19. So right off the bat, you're missing half of them. And then you're going to miss the group that got pre-treated where it was before they developed a fever. So they have decided not to add that to the ways of screening kids.
I have a question, and I know I'll have more, and maybe I should just wait till we get through this section, but you know, so much of this is honor system and trust, and we can't force that on anyone, but I guess it seems like such a fluid moving thing right now. Are we deciding that tonight, or will we, like, are we considering the plan tonight without really knowing exactly how this honor system-based check and the tools to do that is in place? And again, maybe I should just wait to the end, but so much of this is going to be the community trusting each other and trusting us. And social media gives everyone a window into how serious everyone has been taking it or not. So again, I can wait till more, but I guess as we go along, I hope we can kind of get our arms around that almost first before we get into too much. We need to give people an answer on what we're going to do about this. All the public comments, a lot of them have a lot to do with, you know, what's your plan? And so are we hashing that out tonight, like making decisions on that tool, or are we going to maybe come back later and try to refine that?
Which tool are we talking about?
On what we use for the self-check.
I mean, our plan is to be using the self-check.
Yeah.
The CDC
Right.
self-check.
Or a version of this that we can all agree upon. And so I imagine that we would consult Dr. Hannah with and our nurses who have already started working on this for what the best questions should be, and that would be clear and published for families, and that would be what they go through daily before they send anybody out of the house, as well as staff. And that is all that we're required to do. And it does take a tremendous amount of trust to assume everybody is doing that. So there are places that want people to record it and say, just like we have a sign-in and have some sort of digital way that it's recorded. I think in the end, it's always going to be trust-based, whether it's recorded or not. So tonight we weren't planning on going through what the detailed questions were. Okay. It's that we are agreeing to the requirement that there is a self-check, and that by the time staff and students come back, we would have clearly communicated to staff and to families an agreed upon list of questions that Dr. Hannah and our nurses feel is the safest way for us to return.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, it's a good reminder for all of us that all of this will be based on trust, and there is risk in all of it.
I think it's reasonable to assume whether we adopt the plan tonight or tomorrow night or Wednesday night, if it takes that long to get to the questions. But I think it's reasonable to assume that we will approve a plan that includes the detail that is known. But there's going to be an enormous amount of detail that's going to have to follow on at a later date. And that later date is over the next 2 or 3 weeks before we begin school.
Well, that makes me feel
So,
more
I mean,
comfortable.
we're not, and I know a lot of the questions from the public sort of got to that, but I don't think it should be our expectation here that we are going to, at the end of this process, have a step, a flow chart essentially of how, a student enters school. I think that's something that will have to be developed over the next several weeks and modified as we start school and find out what's practical and what needs to be changed.
So much of where we've gotten to has just been what should the plan be. And so now we have, once a plan is approved to start with, just so you all are aware and feel like we won't drop any these balls that are in the air, because there are a lot of them. We have very carefully defined lists that we're working off of that involve, once something is approved, these are the 25 things that the district office has to do, and this is what principals have to do, and this is what our nurses have to do, this is what our teachers have to do, this is what facilities have to do based on the various plans. And I'd be happy to share that with the board, but it does include details. This is on the nurses list, and Dr. Hannah would be part of that group. And so all of these things are accounted for. We just haven't been able to get to that level of detail without knowing, if we weren't going to come back at all, we wouldn't even need this in place. And so we've sort of been waiting on some steps because we have to, but we know that they are steps and will all need to happen this August. Okay, so anything else with self-check before we move on to physical distancing? All right. So what is recommended here is that 6 feet of distance, as we're all getting used to, is maintained between adults. For students, and Dr. Hannah, I might have you just speak about this part here instead of waiting till the end. Maintaining 3 feet of distance as long as students are sort of following the proper safety protocols like masks and hand washing and whatnot. 3 feet is acceptable. When eating, everybody, no matter how old, needs to be 6 feet apart, preferably even more space between, because masks will be off. Windows or ventilation needs to be something that's taken into consideration even more so, even though it's something we're considering a lot right now already. And then further, in terms of how space is used and how much space is required, there are notes here about a medical isolation room that we'll need to have should we, should our nurses feel like there might be someone who does have COVID, in order to reduce the spread. And then finally, ventilation is something we'll talk about later. Patrick will address that and what we've done so far to make sure that that will be safe for people. But I think what we have going for us now, in most cases, not all of our rooms have windows, is the fact that we can open windows for fresh air on buses and in most classrooms, like we have in this room right now. And so that's the sort of thing that would be expected for a while, and then obviously following the governor's gathering size limit. So do you want to talk about the 3 versus 6 feet, Dr. Hannah?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so in looking at information that's out there, I think where they came up with the 3 feet versus 6 feet was really just looking at, in general, how far do respiratory particles spread when we're talking. Respiratory particles are the primary way that COVID-19 is spread. There are some other ways that are not as not as much of an issue as the respiratory particles, but that is the primary way. So when you're talking, most people will spray in about potentially in a 3-foot radius. Last month, there was a nice article that pulled together a number of studies that looked at rates of infection and decreased risk of infection at 3 feet as opposed to 6 feet, as opposed to not doing anything at all. And in this review of multiple articles or multiple studies, they had looked at in this particular group, about a 13% risk of infection if there's no distancing, decreases to about 2.6% at 3 feet, and then at 6 feet, 1.3%. So basically about a 1.3% improvement in your risk if you go to 6 feet. So it's not a huge difference between 3 to 6 feet. So that, I think, is where they're coming up with, this 3 to 6 foot range.
Was that with face coverings?
It's without.
Okay.
So, and that's the key thing. So I have been scouring, looking for something that had masks and distances together, and I couldn't find anything that looked at that. And again, we've only known about this since December, so I don't think they've had enough time really. But then when you look at masking with no distancing decreases your risk to about 3.1%. So if you combine, a distance of 3 to 6 feet plus a mask, that reduces your risk very significantly. So I think that's where they're coming from with, feeling like 3 feet is probably okay, because your risk is fairly low anyway, even if you're unmasked, but add a mask to that and your risk goes down even more.
And so, does that depend on what kind of mask at all? Like, I don't know what we're providing quite yet, I'm sorry, I didn't know that, but I just.
So they looked at multiple different types. So some studies had surgical masks, some had cloth masks, and it was like, because they gathered information from a bunch of different studies. So, and they just kind of did a general, okay, these are the percentages. Yeah, I mean, if you're wearing an N95, obviously you're going to have a lot more protection. But these cloth masks really do offer a lot because they're capturing those particles, and then as it evaporates, the viral particles are left on the inside of your mask. So, there is a lot of benefit to just these cloth masks.
Thank you.
Anything else on the 3 versus 6 feet?
It's not really a question of 3 versus 6. We were talking about, while eating breakfast and lunch. I was wondering if there'd been any thought put toward the number of individuals in a space while masks are on. What's a safe level to an acceptable for that? So like how many individuals should stay in a classroom space and be eating, and should be keeping eat,
I think for us, it was probably half and half in our elementary classes, for example.
and how does that look numbers wise?
I mean, if you had a class of, 18, we'd have 9 kids in there.
That average.
We've gone and measured, all of our classrooms, and, we can, with the exception of maybe two or three classrooms across the district, we can fit what we expect to come back. And again, we don't know, every student that's going to come back because they could choose remote learning, but we felt comfortable with the 3 feet that we, for the K-5, that we could accommodate the majority of our students. And in the 2 or 3 cases that we cannot, we have another common space where we can have students kind of rotate around. But for that lunch piece where they need more space, it would be, having half the kids, well, there's many options. It could be half the kids that go up for recess at that time, and the other half eating in the room. It could be that we do use common spaces within the school, but the tables are set up so that there's more space. There's only 3 kids at a big table, something like that. It could be going outside and eating too. So,
So you have measured, what you're saying though is that you've measured the spaces, so you know what is an appropriate number of students to have in a given space at while they're here.
yeah, I mean,
So you-
we've measured our
Address
classrooms.
that class by
Yeah,
class.
class by class is it's going to depend, and how much space we have in certain classrooms, and whether we have to use common spaces.
Ventilation in older schools, that you all mentioned, are confident, comfortable with assessment of.
Why don't you talk
Yeah, I
about
mean-
ventilation now, because it
Yeah.
sort of relates to this.
I mean, again, I work in education. I'm not in the HVAC company, and so I've got to rely on Dave Richards, who's on the phone tonight, but also we have contacted Siemens, and they're coming. We've had conversations with them about our options, and we've also had them coming and walking our buildings this Thursday again. And anything from O2 prime ionization is one big piece that they're going to be talking to us about, increasing the outdoor airflow. And again, this isn't just for COVID. This is for flu, in general, anything that we can do to help with this. Confirm operation of all of our outside air dampers. Change occupancy schedule to have greater amount of air changes, and that will increase energy costs. But if possible, 24/7 occupancy would be ideal according to them. And then the filters. Looking at our current filters, we usually change those a couple times a year. It may be something where they're going to recommend we do it on a monthly basis. The filter MERV, minimum efficiency reporting valve. I mean, all of these things that I'm learning about. But again, Siemens is an expert. We've also talked with our architect at the new high school as far as possible portable units that could be used within the district as well. So again, we have some money that's coming to the district, and this may be an area where we need to put some of our resources to make sure that in some of our older buildings that we're improving that circulation. And obviously, windows open, fans circulating the air is the baseline, but how can we do a better job throughout the system? And Siemens has been working with a lot of districts and getting recommendations and price tags that go with that. So that will be an upcoming conversation.
Dr. Hannah, when you were saying the studies, obviously they were indoors, so did they ventilate? How did they figure ventilation? Because I can just remember the early studies that came out had to do with why restaurants were bad, the air conditioning, the airflow, and all that. But you're saying it was when distanced, even without masks. But I mean, were they just different places indoor? I'm just trying to understand what the
They were
conditions were.
Well, they were looking at indoor. They didn't talk about ventilation at all in those studies.
So it was just ventilation, just indoors in general.
I have a question about the last bullet there about the gathering size that's recently been increased to 100 from 50. Do we expect to be having up to 100 people in it?
I would say we're going to minimize any sort of gathering at all. And it sort of mentions that towards the end when it says how things will be different. But meetings, conferences, professional development, most of that will all be virtual.
I think if we had to have a decent size, not to exceed anything we talked about, would be, the option would be outdoors, appropriate spacing, but really needed to have something we felt was, to recognize students or to do something like that. But that would be a consideration, but not inside.
I think one thing, if I'm a presenter, but I'd also like to comment that this we measured all the spaces and we can fit this many people, but especially for the 100% return of pre-K to 5, that's with everybody sort of sitting still, 3 feet apart, and being pretty stationary, and so there will still be a lot of bodies in a classroom, and that's going to feel very different for kids and for teachers and could be hard. And so I just think it's worth mentioning to the board that, that the culture of school is something you all should take into consideration when you're making your decision around what, because you have to weigh, it's great to have the younger students in school every day, and I'm sure we'll get into this when we get into the pre-K to 5 part, but it does come, our plan does come with some challenging impacts as well for teachers and for kids that, I think this physical distancing piece is definitely something you're going to want to think more about. Okay. Are we ready to move on to masks and face coverings? All right. So just like we're doing here, masks will be required for all adults and students. And the DOE recently changed their guidelines slightly, saying that for ages 2 to 4, it's recommended but not required. That would only really impact our pre-K students, and we would prefer as best we can to get everybody in the habit because it's safer, as you can see by the sort of the data that Dr. Hannah just shared with us. And so that is a slight adjustment that was made that we'll need to think about. In terms of the use of face shields, that is something right now we're waiting on some clarification from, because if you look at that bullet point, it essentially says they're an alternative for staff and students who might have a medical issue where a mask might not be good for them. And so a face shield with the fabric drape all around to catch any of the particles it seems like it's an exception. We're still waiting on word from the Department of Education. Patrick has an email out to see if we could be using that more regularly. just because so much of teaching is expressive through you know, the emotions you show on your face, or if you're teaching small children's speech, they need to see how your lips and your mouth move. And so we have talked to Dr. Hannah about the safety of that, but don't know if that will be required. So I didn't know if in terms of what's being provided, because I know that came up before, we will have masks on hand for students who don't bring their own or forget or it rips. We won't be giving masks out to every single student. That would be an expectation, unless a family says, we're unable to purchase those, and then we can provide them. Staff, we did buy everybody a mask and a face shield for our whole district community. And so that's sort of what we have on hand. Do you want to talk a little bit about the safety of face shields and whether you think that if it is approved by the DOE, whether that would feel as safe in close quarters for teachers to be wearing and possibly some students?
Sure. Yeah, so, I mean, obviously in an ideal world, we would all be wearing masks, but
Right.
You have kids with hearing impairment, you have kids who have tactile issues, and then there's the whole issue with, being able to see a teacher's face. So if you look at a face shield that's sealed up at the top, and then covers down to the chest, and then you have fabric, which is basically the same thing that you've got on your face right now, down below. I think that offers a lot of the same protection that you're going to have if you're wearing just a mask, and maybe even a little bit more because you're protecting your eyes. And again, it ultimately will be up to Department of Education, but that is good coverage of basically any sort of respiratory secretions that might be coming out of a teacher's mouth, which is the primary role of the mask, but also protects them against what's coming their way.
We also have teachers who, work with students who might need physical assistance and they're going to need to get very close. And so having that further eye protection that a shield provides is going to be something that some of our teachers will have to wear in addition to their mask, or if they can do the shield with a drape, that might be a better option for them if we can really make sure it's secure on them in case they, are working very closely with a student. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add about masks and face shields, or.
Well, we talked about the protective component of it already.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there was anything. I know you had talked about discussing mask breaks, but I don't know.
Yeah. So we can talk about mask breaks now. They do come up later in the plan. So I think part of this, and as someone with a 4-year-old who's learning to wear a mask, it definitely takes work. But I think I found that kids can get used to it. But it takes building that stamina, and so mask breaks are going to be really important. In terms of the ways that can happen, it can be outside. It can be in a room with the windows open, with people more than 6 feet apart, ideally. And so spreading out, using the hallway. And so any way we can do that. And I think with the younger students, that's going to need to be regularly built in on a much more incremental basis as they're learning to do that. Especially, I think we're all in this very warm room. I know I would love to take my mask off right now. It's hard to wear it for a long time and feel that moisture in there and feel like you can't breathe as well. And so I think that we feel very open to the fact that getting kids up and moving, getting kids to take their masks off, having more breaks built into the day, just putting everything down if you can see that they need something or they just need to do something different, even if you have a lesson plan, that's the flexibility that we're going to hope to instill in all of our teachers, to feel that freedom to not, I know they work so hard to get kids through all the material. And part of this, especially in the beginning, is just going to be getting everybody used to what everybody calls the new normal, and feeling like it's okay to spend a large part of your day having to go outside if you need to, because kids need to breathe. It's a really warm day. And so I don't know if anything else about mask breaks you want to add. I mean, those are the safest ways we've discussed with you that would be happening.
Right.
I think one thing on masks, because the question was asked several times in the public comment, was how will masks be enforced? Again, it's, our teachers are going to have, a different role when they come back. It's not going to be just about teaching kids, reading and writing and math. It's, teachers are going to have to enforce that the best they can in the classroom, but this is mandated by the state. This isn't coming from RSU1. This is coming to us, so it's not a choice on our part. And if a student or a boy who's not wearing one, meet, find out why. Is it a medical thing? What is it? And if it's a medical, then our hope is that the answer we get from the DOE is that the option would be ovation for that person. And again, we'd have to take it on a case-by-case basis. If a student just is not wearing it for whatever reason, and it doesn't meet what we just went through, then maybe they have to be moved to remote work. And so we've got to, we need to use some common sense here, but again, what I would say is it's mandated by the state that we have to wear these. So it's not a choice on all of them.
So Patrick, that means any staff coming back to work in person with students would have the understanding that they need to wear a face cover, regardless of what it is, but they would have that expectation that they would be able to do that. And if not, then something else would. Okay.
And
I think it,
go ahead.
no,
I think that this is more appropriate for later when we start actually talking about the plans, but not only do teachers have this extra responsibility of kind of monitoring mask wearing, but I also think as we talk about it as a board, we have a really good opportunity to offer support for teachers and maybe looking at or developing a policy that's very clear that in this scenario, I don't know if it's three, like we're talking, have a conversation first, tell parents, whatever that it might be, but that there's a very clear understanding that this is the consequence or potential change that might have to happen if you can't do it or won't do it. And then that way it leaves a lot of this murkiness over having to recreate the wheel every single time. If somebody, it could be the first time kids are getting this kind of zero tolerance exposure, and that's tough, but we have a chance to support staff, what we do as a body, to develop a policy that is really clear, because we can't make the decision to not let you mask up. So we can talk, I know we'll talk about that later.
Right. Anything else on masks?
I was just going to say it's kind of similar to Warren's comments. I mean, these are practices that I think we also need to turn to parents to support us in school. And again, many of the comments offered were regarding whether or not we had a reasonable expectation that a young child would be able to properly deal with the mask. Well, you're right. It's challenging. We leave it only to the teacher and the school to enforce. It becomes even more challenging. But it will be. There's an expectation, I think, that our parents, our families support us. So this is a real threshold issue, obviously, in terms of the fact that it is a mandate from the state, and kids are going to have to wear masks, and we need parents to help us support good practice, good protocol in wearing that mask. As I improperly continue, it is difficult. There's no question about it. It's difficult.
Yeah, and I do think, Lorna, to your point, I think having a really clear procedure is going to be essential. I think that will come in much more handy with grades 6 through 12. I feel like the mask part for our teachers of younger students is going to be much more of a burden on them with the constant reminders. And that's not to say they shouldn't do it or focus on it. I just think it's worth noting that it will be constant reminders. It will be having to talk about it a lot. And, you know, what teachers are spending their day doing will look very different. So, okay. Ready to move on? Okay, hand hygiene. So there is a very long list. I'm not going to read it out loud because I know you all have this in front of you, of all the times it is required that we properly sanitize everybody's hands, staff, students, including before and after eating, touching your mask, and whatnot. And so we have been spending a lot of time making sure that we're ordering hand sanitizer, hand soap, all of that to ensure that this could happen, and starting to think really creatively. This kind of falls under the details that come next. When we have schools planning all of their individualized systems, how are we going to get students off a bus? How are we going to get them in the building? Where are the stickers going to go on the floor? And that's sort of all the pieces that are on that list I mentioned before that will be coming next. We have purchased a system called Safe Schools. Thankfully, our nurses found it, and it is video training that we're required to do for little kiddos. You know, it does things like how to hand wash, how to social distance, how to wear your face covering, a sort of more young student-friendly way of understanding what COVID is if their family hasn't talked to them about it. And so through this system, whether it's the student modules or the adult modules, we'll be able to make sure that everybody has the proper training in a lot of these things that we're covering, including something that I think, you know, I never realized how long 20 seconds was until I realized I had my whole life been washing my hands incorrectly, apparently. And so I think just things like that, that we take for granted that everybody's been taught, we'll make sure are enforced through the system to further, for another further layer of safety. Anything else? Yes.
It's 10. I counted, it's a minimum of 10 times a
Yeah.
day. So, and they're saying 20 seconds each time.
With soap, yes. With hand sanitizer, it's till it's dry, correct? Or do you have to rub for 20 seconds as well?
I think they want you to have enough on there so that you're rubbing for about 20 seconds, and then it's dry.
Dr. Hannah, is there any concern about exposure to vast, large amounts of hand sanitizer and cleaning agents that would ask students to clean their desks or work areas, things like that? Should we be worried about any of that, especially with smaller kids?
So I guess I'm not sure specifically what cleaning agent they're going to be using. Hand sanitizer, I think the risk that you'd have with that is sometimes kids wind up with dry hands. And that will be more so if they're washing their hands than with hand sanitizer, but the alcohol can be somewhat drying to kids' hands, or to anybody's hands for that matter. But I have to say, I mean, I probably use hand sanitizer 30 times a day, and it's usually not an issue. It was worse with hand washing, but because you're washing away the natural oils, but that is a more effective way to clear any sort of infection from your lungs. Yeah. So the chemicals, I think the kids are not necessarily cleaning on their own. It's somebody else that's cleaning for them, and that's dry and not something that's going to be wet and getting on their skin at that point. So I wouldn't think that there would be an issue with that.
Yeah. And I think most of the chemicals we use, we want them to dry before anyone touches them, because that's actually an indicator that everything has died if there was anything on the surface. So that would be, again, something else to train the students in. You know, if you come across a wet desk, you know, hands up, you need to wait because it's not ready for you to touch it yet. Okay, personal protective equipment. This goes into detail about what the nurses will need, as well as what, you know, needs to happen. There's a whole slew of different protocols that are on the DOE website, should there actually be a case within the building. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Hannah to talk. Do you want to talk a little bit about should there be a case, or anything else you had on your notes? I think we've kind of gone through some of the the items we want to do to speak on, but.
Sure. Yeah, so in terms of what we do if there is a case, first off, our guidance will be coming from the CDC. They will have a dedicated person that our school nurse will call, say we have a positive case, and they are going to walk through what we need to do at that point. And that probably has a lot to do with what's happening in the community, how many students are positive within a school. And so it will be different in various situations. I think at a minimum, if you're looking at risk, it's really going to be who's in the class. We're keeping kids cohorted in classes, so they're in one group. So technically by CDC guidelines, to be considered at risk for exposure, it's being within 6 feet for 15 minutes or more. And I would think that in a classroom with kids moving around, at some point, they're going to be within that range, as with the teacher. I talked with the epidemiologist at the main CDC earlier today, who basically said, if they're in that classroom, they ought to be considered exposed. And so right now, by current guidelines, if someone is exposed, they need to go get tested. If they can't get tested or won't get tested, then they need to quarantine for 14 days. And that's if they have no symptoms. If they develop symptoms, there's a different pathway that you follow. So that would be for kids that are in the class, the teacher that's in the class. If another teacher, like a specials teacher, comes in, that person. If the specials teacher comes in and is at risk for exposure, but then goes to another classroom and doesn't have symptoms, that's not considered an exposure for the rest of the school. It's just the classroom where the person is. By current guidelines, again, some of it feels like it's a bit of a moving target here.
So I think the other thing we talked about with the CDC today was notification, and what was recommended to us was, we would notify staff and parents and families of that school. Obviously, word spreads fast, but what they recommended was we notify by school, and then as far as they would give us guidance. Dr. Hannah just mentioned the class would have to either be quarantined or tested before coming back. But if they felt like we explained the situation to them, it's middle school, high school, or elementary, then the CDC may feel like we have to do more than the classroom. It could be the school. But that was their guidance that they gave us today. And again, it's going to be a designated person up there that is who we would call if we have a confirmed case of one of our students or staff.
What about? Sorry, you
Potential
go
that
first.
we could just have to close classroom, don't have to close an entire building.
Potentially.
That would be the track and trace. I mean, that's the whole point, right? Isolated, figure out who's there. And that's how you that's how you determine whether it's the classroom or the whole school.
I think Dr. Hannah could weigh on this better than I can, but if you think about how middle school, high school rotate,
Right.
Even though we're trying to minimize that even a little bit, I would think that the class is probably maybe more of an option at the elementary level than when we have a case in the middle school, high school, it may be more because of
Well,
just
right, yeah,
how
because they're not
much
staying
moving
still.
around.
Sure.
Right.
So,
What about if the infected person had been in the cafeteria and maybe sat far away from another group, another pod of students? Is that considered close enough, or is that like the teacher is going in and out and being with other groups?
Yeah, I mean, if the pod is far away, I mean, if you're thinking 6 feet for 15 minutes and a pod is far away,
Then that's fine.
that
Okay.
doesn't, that's not an exposure. And I think they're using the whole classroom, even though you may have kids that are not within 6 feet if they're
Great,
sitting there, but in the classroom, people are going to move around.
absolutely. Okay.
Patrick, could you just, when we talk about notification, would we notifying just in the classroom scenario, would we notifying just the classroom parents, or would it be the entire school?
the recommendation this morning was just letting the whole school, know, obviously, no names or anything.
Yeah.
Just saying that we had a positive case.
One.
And that we're either quarantining the class, or that we're going to advise by the CDC to quarantine when they shut down the school.
And we would do that communication via Is there?
Probably use our, our pathogen program and get it out to staff and to students and families through, all measures.
About siblings of children in that class.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the communication would probably happen.
Would they have to
Right,
stay
so-
home as well? Or the
Yeah, so
testing as well?
the siblings of the person who's infected, they either have to quarantine or, well, they would have to quarantine from their last exposure to that person. So siblings of other kids who are in the class who do not have symptoms don't have to quarantine. So that's like it's like an extra step exposure. So it's really direct exposure. So unless one of those kids tested positive or developed symptoms.
I had a few constituents send me a New York Times article, I'm sure you saw it, about the Indiana school that closed the first day, middle school. And, no one ever knows the full background story on that and what happened. But that, of course, caused a lot of anxiety. But what I'm hearing us say now is that we acknowledge we have to have some kind of notification plan. Don't know all the details on that right yet, but that just to assure people that, I think people are looking like, well, if we have to close every 2 weeks, every time someone comes to school with COVID-19 or something, I'm hearing that we're not really looking at that right now. We got to hammer out what our notification system is. We're going to have a CDC contact, and they're going to walk us through it. Right? Because again, things like that just immediately cause so much fear, and I get it, but I just really want to stay local in all this. And when it happens, we'll figure it out. But I'm hearing that we will figure that out, what the notification is going to be, and what the process will be if that happens, and what raises the level. Because some people are saying, well, like in the comments, is it just if you're sneezing that you have to assume they have it, or do they actually have to be positive? I'm hearing that we'll flush that out fairly soon.
I think it has to be, a positive case of COVID is when we would
Okay.
notify people. I mean, as far as what we said earlier, this, I think, our nursing staff, I don't want to speak to them, but, when students may come down with a fever or with, some other, like I said, one symptom of COVID, it's going to be taken that much more seriously. But again, as far as notification, it would be with a positive case, it would be notification that we would put out to a school population.
And a positive case is being tested by the testing facility. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
We're all set to move into the kind of.
Is there anything else you wanted to share before we?
Well, one thing, just going back to the positive case on the first day of school. So that wasn't a case where the child contracted it at school. And I think that's important to kind of
Yes.
point out that that's someone who contracted it before
Came to
they,
school.
and they came to school.
And that's where the honor system on the
Right,
self-check comes in.
right.
Right.
Yeah. And, when you look at, and I can talk about this later, but, looking at, transmission of COVID-19 from child to child or child to adult, the primary way that kids get infected with COVID-19 is through household contacts. So they're living with an adult who got it and then spread it to them. And there are a number of different school situations where kids have gone in and had it, and the spread has been minimal to none.
All right, so next section is just the,
Can I ask one question? Is in terms of infection, is the length of exposure a factor? I mean, we get a lot of, many of our comments are, don't send kids back for 5 days, it's safer to send them back for 2. If you're exposed to an individual within that day, it really only takes 1 day, one incident exposure, right? Is there any statistic or any numbers? I mean, is it a 30-minute exposure? Is it a 5-hour exposure? What are we looking?
Yeah, so by current CDC guidelines, they consider a 15-minute exposure of being within 6 feet of someone to be a risk. And then beyond that, there's not like a you know, a graph that you can follow to say, okay, you're with them for an hour now, your risk is this, or, you know, it doesn't, they're just looking at, okay, this is what we're going to consider a risk of exposure. So that, you know, if someone has COVID-19 and they're walking past you in the grocery store, that's not really a risk because you're not really spending a lot of time with them. So I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, no, it does.
Okay.
But I think something that we've had to consider on different committees is how long particles do stay in a contained space. So when we were going through all these options, we did consider everybody coming in the half in the morning and half in the afternoon. But then Dr. Hannah shared with us that it takes particles about 3 hours to kind of land and then die. And so that wasn't a great idea if we were thinking of containing smaller groups of kids, because we'd have one group in the morning in the same space as one group in the afternoon with the same air particles in the air. So it can be actually being in the same space with someone, or the air is in there contained in a high concentration too, and you're going to that space, right?
Right. And what's settling still and getting on surfaces.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, we're getting to some of our questions at the end, which is fine, but we might as well stay on this for a second. So,
Yeah.
you know, that was one plan that we had was half days, you know, all the way through the district. And we were thinking that that was a good idea. But again, you know, from the health perspective, it wasn't, because if we got done, say at 11 or 11:30 with the group, and we would have to, you know, significantly wait for a period of time, and then we'd have to be looking at maybe 3 to 6 in the evening or 4 to 7, you know, to bring the other group back, to have enough time for the cleaning and the particles to dissipate. So that was one thing. And then the other one, which is going to come up at some point, so we might as well deal with it now, is and we can go either way with this, but the reason that we, in the plan right now for 6 through 12, went with one group coming Monday, Thursday, and the other group coming Tuesday, Friday, was primarily so that they would be in person, kind of would be spread out. They wouldn't have like almost a week without any, you know, seeing a teacher or seeing a guidance counselor. And, you know, if you're in there one day in person, then you have a couple days to do, you know, kind of your work, and then come back and process that with the teacher. So numerous questions came in and said, you know, is that a concern you have? Why not go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday off, and Thursday, Friday? Because those same kids would be sitting in the seats in that room. But, you know, can you speak to that, Dr. Henry, as far as?
I can, yeah. So, again, all of this has been just trying to balance, you know, your physical health, your mental health, both are equally important. But when you're just looking at the ability to let everything kind of settle, even if someone had it and was undetected, but the particles settle, do a deep clean, you can do that overnight so that the next kids coming in the following day have a clean environment to be in. So then if you can create a safe place physically for them, is it better than emotionally from a mental health perspective for them to have that contact? I know personally in my practice, I have seen more kids who have emotional concerns or mental health concerns than I've seen ever, and I've been practicing here for 21 years. And I think that it's important that we look at that, and so having kids have that contact with their teachers, the guidance counselor, and even just, quite honestly, seeing their peers at school makes a huge difference. So if they don't have to go almost a full week before they see all of those important people in their lives, I think from a mental health and an emotional perspective, it's healthier for them.
Thank you.
And along those lines of what Patrick was saying, I had a constituent who was thinking that, and I understand, you know, that the 5 days would allow more time for the virus to reveal itself. But would you speak to that? I mean, my first thought is, person is still presumably out and about and still potentially, you know, I mean, yes, he or she's not in school, but would you just speak to that, since it did kind of come up on, would the 5 days be a better time for the person to be away from school so not to be exposed?
Yeah, so I think that if you're looking at, you know, kids who are absolutely going to be quarantined and not go anywhere else, maybe that's true. But I think the reality is that kids are out and about doing other things. And so their exposure could happen at any point on any one of those days that they're not at school. It could happen the day before they go back for their 2 days, or it could happen after it. So I don't know, unless we're in lockdown or a child is in lockdown, and some kids might be, but I think that that exposure can happen at any point. So the 5 days, in my mind, doesn't necessarily seem like we have to go that route. There are other things that seem to be equally as important.
Okay, ready to jump into K-5? I mean, I would start with by saying this is one question that came up a couple times, and it kind of goes with the sections and I was going to it. Dr. Gannon, please add, but why is it being proposed by the committee to bring pre-K-5 back 100% to 6 to 12 in a hybrid situation? You know, a couple of reasons that the committee talked about is, you know, the elementary is more self-isolated in a classroom, where specialists are going to come to them. They're with that same group of students all the time, pretty much all the time. So that's one reason. The risk is less for younger kids. You know, I'm talking again, I talked to that. And then also, you know, when we went around to all of our schools and measured, we just, you know, we don't physically have the space, you know, within our schools to do that 3-foot distancing at our middle school level. Not everywhere, but in enough places at the middle school and high school that make that very challenging to do. You want to talk about the
Can I add 2 more quick
Yeah, go ahead,
reasons?
please.
It's a lot harder often to do extended distance learning with younger students as well. And also the factor of families being able to get back to work potentially. So those are 2 other reasons that we considered as well.
And as Dr. has said before, I think the reasoning saying, oh, well, if you didn't have a little kid there, you wouldn't be exposed as much. I mean, then for many families, those maybe not the specific people asking, but many families, then they have to get childcare. So the kids are going to get exposed, you know, they're going to have other risk factors. In fact, if you've got the consistency of school every day, that might actually be better than get a certain population going to this daycare or that daycare or other places where you know, we're all following the same rules. So,
Agreed.
it's just what made sense to me.
And then I think we were going to talk a little bit about risk, you know, risk in different age groups. And I'll throw out some numbers because I do think that the numbers are pretty compelling. So if you look in the United States, about 7% of the cases of COVID-19 are under 18 years of age, or 18 years of age or under. They're less than 1% of the deaths, they're 1% of the hospitalizations. But kids under age 18 are 22% of our population in this country. So it's a small number of kids who wind up getting infected. And then more recently, they've looked at ages. So 10 and under, those kids, there are lots of hypotheses about why this happens, but those kids are at a significantly lower rate or risk of contracting COVID-19 than kids who are above the age of 10. And that has been looked at in a few different countries where they just did blanket testing of everybody. So not just people who are symptomatic, because in our country you could say, okay, they didn't get tested because they had mild symptoms, so they didn't hit that threshold of being able to get a test. But they've looked in other countries where they've just done testing of the you know, cohort of population, asymptomatic or symptomatic, and those kids still are at a significantly lower risk. And when they've looked at outbreaks in schools or kids who have come in, generally, if you have a positive case, it's not because there have been other positives in their classroom. It's because there's a positive at home, and that's where they've gotten it. So that's really that's the grade school up until you're pretty much in middle school, that group where your risk is lowest. So again, that was part of the equation with saying, okay, could we bring these kids back 100%? You know, we've got a lower risk, we're going to mask, we're going to distance, all that into it.
So just quickly, I'm not going to read all the bullets, but for the pre-K to 5, again, it was 100% of the time, 5 days a week. Students at desk tables would be a minimum of 3 feet apart, and all students would wear the masks. Obviously, we have purchased desks to take out tables, and especially at our lower elementary level. We just feel like that would, obviously lends itself better to having your own individual desk and sharing a table and trying to keep students apart. The majority of specials will come into the classrooms to teach, have those pods stay there. Obviously, PE is going to look different anyway, but PE could happen in the gym as long as they're 6 feet and they wear a mask, or they could be going outside to have PE class. But again, the majority would come into the classroom. Music's an area where we still need to have conversation because, maybe look at some alternatives and what we can do with music instead of singing. Students will spend the day with the same pod of students in the classroom. Give mask-free breaks like we talked about throughout the day. And lunch will be brought to the individual classrooms in a lot of cases. But again, like we talked about before, there may be common areas in the school that we set up as well, and maybe use the outside for that as well. Recess will be done. I know that question came up quite a bit. Recess, we suggested recess as a possible option at lunchtime, but half the kids could be eating in the room and half would go out for recess. But that does not mean that that's the open recess for students. Like we will have teachers can take their students out on their own. Masks are not required when they go out for recess. Obviously, if a class had a problem with keeping 6 feet apart, we might have to do something different. But you could, some of our playgrounds, you could have more than one class out there at a time, as long as we had the supervision and kids were keeping the distance away. And then the last thing just to point out at pre-K to 5 is 2 bus runs would need to accommodate, because again, we're talking about 1 student seat on a bus. So we have talked about bus, and because we're trying to manage the middle school, high school run as well, is that we would have to do 2 runs, and you have the times there, 8:20 and 9:20 roughly, and then the dismissal would have to be different. So I guess you could argue that the negative is that, as a teacher, you're not getting all your students in at the same time. I guess a positive, you could see it as I'm getting half my students, coming in off that bus. It's a little more manageable, for the breakfast, and it's a little more manageable to get them in, washing their hands. If there's only, say you got 16 kids, it's only 8 coming in. You use that first hour for intervention, for some enhancement with kids, enrichment, and then you do have, if this goes through, you would have everybody in there for a while, and then at the end of the day, again, you would have some kids going home, and you have some kids staying a little bit longer in this case. So that's, in a nutshell, the pre-K to 5. I would say that, like Katie said before, it's going to be different for these students, these younger students. It's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the same for our teachers. We've had comments from some staff that have concerns about bringing young students back 100% of the time, and having them there all day. So I do want to express that to you. Just concerns about the health and safety and just the monitoring of the face masks and the social distancing, and then the comments that you've received that you can read those as far as concerns, wondering if a hybrid is more appropriate. So I do want to just put that out there to you.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of, so when you say like half the class, but we don't know, like it may be someone might have 3/4 of their class, another one might have 1/4 of their class. I mean, I don't know how, first, you have to determine who's getting driven, how many people are getting, it's a really huge logistical issue. Yeah. So it's not going to be an even.
Yeah, we're gonna try our best,
Based on where everybody is to try to even it out.
Yeah, we gotta find out who's driving, right. We're encouraging parents to pick up and drop off as much as they can. And then we've talked about bus numerous times about how can we do routes where, it might be fairly even, but yeah, it's not gonna be perfect as far as 50-50.
And so I'm trying to, I always report with the hours here, are their days a little shorter?
Yes.
They're a little shorter, right?
Yeah.
Usually
an hour shorter.
8:20 and you get out at closer to 3, and this time it would be what, 2?
Yeah.
It's about an hour.
Everybody's day across the district will be an hour shorter because we need a 3rd bus run. And if families do drive their student, they won't stay for an hour more than everybody else. They would get assigned
One of those times.
the 8:20 time or the 9:20 time. And so it will be a huge, like GRE problem solving thing of trying to figure out how to get all the because one of the things with the buses as well is making sure that, if you have a student in 6th grade and one in 11th grade, we
Right.
also want to make sure they get there on the same hybrid days, for instance, which we're about to talk to. And so once we have the go-ahead, the next step would be surveying families to see, 2 things. Are they planning on sending their student based on the plan that was approved by the board? And possibly, we're not sure we'll include it, but are they able to drive? Are they planning to drive their child? So we have that information as well and can plan around that.
So I'm just saying, I think that's something that should be emphasized in terms of kids are wearing masks all day. It is a slightly shorter day.
Yes.
There is that factor. And then, I don't know if this is the time to talk about it or not, like you said, with them going outside, was there talk of doing as much outside as possible when the weather is appropriate in terms of classroom and stuff? That
Yep.
important too.
Many of the principals have already started talking about how to divide and assign their outdoor space to teachers. So, Mrs. Moran would have this section of the field. And obviously some places have more areas than others, but, so people can use this at the outdoors as much as possible.
I just went to an event and they drew circles on the grass and so everyone had their safety circle.
Right.
And you can put your mask on. And I just thought how nice that would be to have that visual, space somebody gets to
Yeah.
see it,
Or even, I'm sure many of you have seen the pictures of kids walking down halls like this with their airplane arms out, because that helps them make sure they're far enough apart in line when they're walking. So things like that, we're going to be
So
Needs to be
long
very
we've asked them
creative.
not to have their We're training teachers as well as training.
So again, from a pre-K-5 perspective, it would be an extra bus run for the district, which this cost to. And if we went to a hybrid at the elementary, our plan would be Monday, same type of
Same
thing.
plan.
And it would just require one bus run. But it's 50% kids, but again, they're going to be coming to school in person twice a week.
I think one thing that's interesting to point out, and we had many comments from the public on this, start with a couple days, sort of, ease into the longer schedule. But I think from this discussion, what impresses me is that these are really 2 very different scenarios. And you organize buses for 2 days very differently than you would organize the routes for all 5 days. You're bringing all kids back, as opposed to bringing some of the kids back.
Well, I think,
Still do it every day.
yeah, I think we would actually, we need to plan it so it works whether we're in hybrid or not. And the buses would hopefully need to stay mostly the same, because it needs to be based on siblings. And also it's very possible we could be a month into school and need to go into hybrid because
But the day would be differently. Whether, if you are, only dealing with half the population, half the number of kids in school at any time, and it isn't the same set of practices, procedures, protocols.
I think it would always be the same, so you would just have fewer people doing it. That would be one of the keys, to make it flexible, so it's for 2 students in a room versus, a room with 15. And because if you're a kindergartner, it's going to be hard enough to learn the first set of rules in the first place. So we want to make it as clear and simple and consistent, regardless of what model we're in, as possible.
I have I'm sorry, are you done with this section, Patrick? I'm sorry. So, when I first saw this, I was so excited for those families that need to get back to work and just those young children, especially the special ed population, which we haven't talked about yet. But then it ended up, when I read all the comments and I've been talking to people since, this is the one that's actually resonated the most with me as far as concerns. And they were all actually addressed in the public comments. A little over a year ago, behavior was rising to the surface, and self-regulation and all that. I didn't notice the 1 hour less a day, which I'm glad that was pointed out. And I guess all I would say is that if we do this, again, I'll just emphasize that we need to, as a community and as a board, to get some means in place to just really support this happening. And I know that we're not supposed to have extra volunteers in the building, but maybe this is a really good time to get partnerships with our PTAs, who for once don't have to be a fundraising entity necessarily, and maybe there's some parents that can get cleared or screened to at least in the beginning of the year to help with hand washing or help monitor recess. I mean, do we even know what our staffing is yet, or is that coming? Like, who's even coming back? We must have some staff that are not. Because the survey a while ago, there was 15%.
Yeah, I mean, that's something, once we have a plan approved, that we'll be, talking with staff. It's something that we expressed an interest in, maybe online, remote learning, if they have concerns, but we don't have that data.
We have to have the plan, the official plan to say, because before the question was, do you feel okay coming back with these guidelines in place? That's
Right.
very different than will you choose to be physically present? And so that would be the next piece. But I think, we've sort of been waiting on this because they need to know what they're agreeing to specifically.
I understand. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Single
it was
families.
just as we keep going through this, I can't emphasize enough what a great time for the community, for us to ask for help. Because for so long we've just, we provided meals and we've provided resources and we've provided this and that, and now we flip the switch and we haven't provided it for a while. So now as we go back, maybe it's asking for more help or cooperation or relief for teachers or whatever it is as we go along and try to formalize what this is all done.
With both sort of pots of extra money that we've gotten, both with our CARES money as well as the state money that Patrick referred to, the main sort of other than the ventilation piece, which would be a substantial cost. The main thing we're looking into is supporting teachers and students with more bodies, more intervention, making sure we can catch kids up, making sure we have enough people to monitor bathrooms and hand washing and all of those things so everybody feels safe, making sure potentially that we have a building sub per building at least, so we have someone we can rely on that can lend an extra hand, or if people are out, since that's going to be tricky as well. And so I think if there was a careful way we could feel was safe to have people, extra people, we're going to need all the help. But I think to your point, there are many people's point is we went back and forth so many times with what the plan is, and unfortunately there's just no good plan. And so the pre-K to 5 plan, I think, makes us really excited in a lot of ways, and it also makes us very nervous, to be quite honest. And our teachers, you saw many of their comments, and we've seen others. I think we want to make sure to honor that and know that when we read those emails, I agree with almost everything that's commented on, because it's true. It is going to be hard, and so again, that's something the board will need to determine is what to do about that.
Well, it's difficult no matter what you do.
Right.
Because if you said, okay, we're doing a hybrid, if the proposed plan had been a hybrid at the elementary level, then the letters you would have received from all the folks who said, that if I can't get there, I can't work. I mean, I'm not saying.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm just saying that if the plan had been originally to go hybrid with the elementary schools, then the letters you would have received most likely would have been, well, here's why I think you need to go 100% of the time. I mean, if you're already proposing 100% of the time, you're not going to get the folks who think that that's a good idea commenting much.
Yeah.
I'm not saying one's right or wrong. I'm just saying,
You're saying
whatever you
likely got
propose,
the same number, the same volume of feedback.
right,
From a
and the volume of
perspective.
feedback would probably be the other one. So I mean, there's valid reasons on both sides. I'm not saying it's one or the other. I'm just saying I think that's why you're getting wonderful detail from people who really thought this through and said, these are my concerns and I get it. I just think that if we do go with an every day, what you really want to emphasize is a slightly shorter day. Kids are going to be outside. There are going to be breaks. but there's also a consistency that I think overall is healthier than them not being there. In terms of, not that anyone has all that control, but I still think overall the consistency from everything I'm hearing seems to be better. But
And I do think that we would also want to consider, and I know Patrick was going to bring this up, easing in to, if you do determine that the 100% pre-K to 5 is what you want to go with as a board, that, the first month will potentially look not 100%, because we need to make sure students work up their stamina at that age. Teachers have all the procedures down before they have all those little bodies in their room. And so that's something that I think would be, trickier for working parents, but in the end, hopefully would work for everybody a little bit better.
you mean to it and ease into it. So
Yeah.
start as a hybrid or a certain number of days. Yeah, that.
And we would need to
That makes
decide
sense.
whether there would be distance learning or just shorter days, or some kid, because if we're not going to end up doing full distance learning, that would be a lot for a teacher to plan distance learning in addition to the in-person for just a month and
Right.
start all those practices.
Yeah.
So maybe it's just no distance learning and we have a similar hybrid model or half days or something. But I think that would definitely be our recommendation, that we ease into whatever the practice or plan is.
What are other districts around us doing as far as using height? I know one parent had told me 75 is doing using the younger kids.
Yeah, we've talked with them, we've had communication, I'm sure they've had a formal meeting, vote, I think they put options out there. I mean, as far as how long, the only one I know of right now, because I've talked to them, is Yarmouth. It's going for a month, I believe. Hybrid, and then revisit it, but yeah, they're very positive communication, I don't think they've officially quoted on their plans yet. Ready to move to 6 to 12? Yeah.
Okay, so 6 through 12, I'm going to move a little bit more quickly because we've talked about a lot of this in the other conversations. So we've discussed why it would potentially be Monday, Thursday in person versus Tuesday, Friday. What we haven't talked as much about is why, and right now we're thinking it might be Wednesdays is the day. It's tricky to say off because it's not really off, but if you think about 6 through 12 teachers having to both plan for in-person and distance learning, and run both of those simultaneously, they are going to need more planning time than we normally would give them, because that's just a much greater load. So that needs to be happening on Wednesdays. We also want to make sure that students have more virtual check-in times on that day. That was some of the feedback we got. And so there might be different guidance groups that are happening on those days, or student groups that are happening on those days virtually. That fifth day will also be class time, depending on the courses students are taking. We have students who are doing AP courses, and some of those classes might not be able to take, really have any time to take a day off potentially. And so it will depend at the higher levels about the student's course load. And then finally, for those students that are, struggling, they might be asked to be bussed in on that fifth day. If they're having a hard time connecting through the internet or with their teachers through classes, they might get assigned to come. Depending on a student's IEP, they might not be doing distance learning and be in all 5 days instead as their programming, and their teacher wouldn't potentially be doing any distance learning. They'd be doing in-person learning for those smaller groups of students who might be in some of our life skills courses or whatnot. And so that's kind of what we're thinking. It's a flex day to connect, to support, to take classes still, to potentially have students in for intervention and connection. And so that's the idea right now. Morse, as I'm sure, we've said this before in our letter, it's also in here, is going to be semesterized. So instead of taking 8 classes, students will take 4. The purpose behind that was both to reduce the amount of kids who are seeing each other throughout the day, as well as make it much more manageable for anybody who's taken an online class. Having 8 online classes potentially to manage as a high schooler is tricky, and so it would be 4 instead. Bath Tech will be working off a similar semesterized schedule, and depending on what the board decides, they will be working, and Patrick and Julie have already been in communication with the other districts we work with, because it will be tricky to try to coordinate with everybody. So as we've already talked about, we're going to try to coordinate schedules with busing, with 50% being sibling groups and family groups, potentially starting with, coordinating by last names. And that there would be an hour less here with a 1:15 dismissal. Woolwich Middle School would be running on the pre-K to 5 schedule, because it doesn't make sense for them to have 2 separate schedules going on in their building. And I believe that the rest of this plan is the same. So as we said before, attendance and grading will be as it is with regular school. I think different than last spring, where we were just kind of figuring things out as we went. I think it's hard to imagine that this is going to be what the year is, but I think knowing that it might be, we need to continue with our usual procedures and having a higher accountability for students. And so that's something that all the principals are in support of. So questions about that?
So how will taken students who are distance learning,
We still have to work out all the details, but I would say a rough plan right now is through assignment submission and also showing up to, they'll actually be required to sign on with teachers at specific times, and so their participation in courses through comments and whatnot.
So like so if I go Monday and Thursday, and Tuesday and Friday, are we different courses? Would there actually be courses, or is it?
Potentially, if teachers are done at 1:15, they could potentially use their planning time, and so there might be. Yeah, it depends on, I think every teacher will figure out a different way how they want to run it. We'll have similar course general guidelines, but people will need to use their time sort of creatively.
So, I'm sorry. So so I'm in class Monday, Thursday, on Tuesday, I'm checking in, or because the teachers are still teaching their kids, or is it?
There definitely could be check-ins first thing before a teacher's teaching, maybe during a planning period, maybe at 1:15, and it wouldn't be the same for everybody.
Right,
But
I
some of the
understand.
distance learning would be potentially with a person on the screen with you who's a teacher.
Depends
Yeah.
on what it is.
Exactly.
And what are they thinking then I guess you can do some of that by class in high school. Like in the middle school, are we doing this by house? Are we doing only half of the given house is coming in a given day? Like how?
It's by last name, isn't it?
By last
You said
name,
by last
yeah.
name, what do you mean? So it's.
Alphabetical.
Yeah.
No, okay.
So you can do it by family. And then you try to move some families around so you have generally even numbers by house, let's say, because those are the kids that are integrated together. Yeah.
When you say Woolwich is on the same, you mean just on the bus schedule, like the Woolwich Middle School kids are still doing hybrid? Or are they going full day?
Yes, thank you for that clarification. They are doing hybrid, but they're on the same bus schedule. Thank you. Okay.
You mentioned IEP, kids with IEPs might be able to, or under the hybrid plan, might be able to access services 5 days
Yes.
a week. So our elementary kids, if there's bring them back 100%, they would have access to those IEP services.
Yes.
And there is a likelihood if needed, those
I'm sorry,
students.
Steve, could you speak up? Sorry, I can hear you.
I'm afraid. We're talking about IEPs, students with IEPs.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to confirm that we'll be able to serve those kids, 6 through 12, with IEPs might be able to serve it 5 days a week, even under the hybrid.
Yeah, are you talking about in person or
That's,
distance?
that's right. My understanding was you said we might be able to bring them in 5
Yes.
days a week.
Depending on what program they're in for special education, yes.
So it would be in person.
So that starts to address the special ed and some of the other stuff folks were asking about.
How about, one of the issues we had last spring, and it was understandable because we were crisis mode, the lack of engagement. How are you gonna determine, or are you gonna have a chance to think about this yet? Was when does a student reach a place? Have you decided, what's, like, where is that line of an acceptable level of engagement, participation, and attendance, and when a student tips over, where you're gonna respond? You're gonna do
We
some
haven't
intervention.
decided on it, it's a great question, on a specific number yet, but we will before school starts. But essentially, in terms of broad sort of guidelines, what we've said is if a student is having a hard time staying engaged, having a hard time passing, especially due to the distance learning part, that would be a student who would be asked to come in on a Wednesday to ensure that they are getting some intervention, possibly some help one-on-one with a counselor, perhaps, if that's part of the issue, to just make sure that we're checking in with them, to help them both on their work, but also do they have an internet connection, and just kind of working through all of that. So, I think the Wednesday piece is one of our goals of that, is to catch those kids before we get to the end and we realize their grades are too far gone or their participation is too far gone.
Yeah, my concern is kids who sort of check out and disengage, and at that level, especially when you get up to high school, that's when you start losing them. Increase. See that as a huge risk.
Mm-hmm.
Is there?
We had, as we talked about this past spring, a lot of success with our, what did we officially call that program? Did we officially call it the Hail Mary program?
Your cafeteria program.
But a lot of the students that you're talking about, Anita, are the ones who came, and through that, when we talk about wanting to hire some extra people who can really connect with kids, really intervene, part of that person's responsibility would also be for some of the students you're talking about who need that Hail Mary extra support. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that program we used for graduation last year is something that we're able to use throughout, hopefully, a version of it throughout the whole year.
Has there been any discussion on vocational possibly going 5 days a week? Did that come up at all? I was just curious about that.
Yeah, those are specific questions someone asked, but it's specific to that school, and so we didn't put it in tonight. But we've got to talk with our sending schools as well, because there's busing involved.
Right.
Schedule involved, usually 2-hour blocks at a time. Some of those students are more students, but some are from our other 3 sending schools. So we've got to see what can work and what that's going to look like. So that's a detail we have to work on.
Just as a time check, we're at 7:43, and so we have to make a motion if we want to go past 8. We've got a lot more to do, but just,
Yes, no, we have a lot more to do. Let's just.
I'll keep an
working.
eye on it for you, if that's okay?
Just keep working.
Anything else on 6 to 12 right now before we kind of I don't think Kate's going to go through every point on
No, I'm
distance
not.
learning, but
And yeah,
just know that it's, we've put this out there as an option, like many schools have, just because we feel like we owe it to our students and our families to continue that as an option if they have to choose that. So I'll let Katie go, but we're looking at using some of our own staff to do that, which may mean that, depending on numbers, that we may have to hire some additional staff to be able to teach in person if that's the way it goes. But I'll turn this over to Katie for just some highlights of the distance.
no, it's great, because that's actually what I was going to start with. A lot of this depends on the staffing data that we'll be able to collect and the student data once we have an official approved plan. So families and staff can say, yes, I feel like I want to do this, or no, I can't for whatever reason. And so if someone's immunocompromised, lives with an elderly family member in their immediate household who they're worried about, whatever it may be, has a child in their own family who, has a heart condition or whatever that is, we want to make sure that we're being supportive of them. And so people would need to make a commitment by August 17th. And right now we're thinking that that would go through December break. The reason why we would not be able to accommodate people jumping in and out is the idea would be whichever teachers are at home, we would match them with caseloads of students who also are at home. So they're getting, so students are getting a much more sort of authentic, individualized experience and connection through distance learning, rather than just having a teacher who's already with other kids 5 days a week or trying to manage these other things. And so they really are getting a true, full distance learning model. It might look a little bit different. And again, this is one of the things that I would say we haven't been able to really plan this out in detail because we don't know what the numbers look like yet. And so that's been a little bit tricky. But for pre-K to 5, it would be sort of a one-on-one, just like it is in the classroom. You would have a classroom teacher and you'd be connected with that person. They would teach most of your subjects, except I would say for specials where we would need other people to sort of jump in and out of that instruction. It would potentially be a teacher who is not in your building, because there might be a whole building of elementary teachers where everybody feels like they can be physically present, but we might have another building with 5 people who can't. And so really what we're going to try to do is match students with the teacher that can best meet their needs in terms of where they are with their learning. For 6 through 8, when things get a little bit more specialized, we were thinking we would do a humanities teacher and a math science teacher and match them that way, just because I'm a former middle school English and social studies teacher. I'm not sure I could teach 8th grade science and feel really good about it. And so we want to make sure that kids are, again, getting the instruction they need. So those students would have 2 potential major check-ins and then specials people added in. And then for 9 through 12, I would say this is the trickiest because, there aren't necessarily a lot of people, for instance, who can teach calculus and things like that. And so this would be having the 2 days of distance learning, possibly adding in some Odyssey-ware, which is an online curriculum we sometimes use for students. And then finally, having them be able to tune into the lessons that they're missing, potentially, or recording things that they can then watch later from the actual instruction. If there's only one person who can teach AP X, then you need to be able to watch that teacher teaching that subject. And so, again, that goes on the list of details to figure out. And so, in terms of attendance and grading, it would be a similar approach where we've already sort of talked about this. Full participation. Participation would look like turning in assignments, checking in when a teacher is online, or if that doesn't work for a family for whatever reason, at least communicating that and saying, I can check in with you at this time instead. I have to watch my baby sister during that time, or whatever it may be. I think that was really, and we're guessing it will be a similar time frame to what it was this spring, which is 2 to 3 hours daily, depending, some of which would be synchronous, meaning it needs to happen at the same time as a teacher to get direct instruction, and sometimes it would be asynchronous. So a teacher could record something that a student could watch whenever they're able to. Questions about that?
August 17th is the day we're hoping to have people make decisions.
I mean, that's what we picked just to try to, for planning purposes. We can adjust that, but we just felt like getting a date out there. If we feel like, the ad team feels like we need more time than that to be fair, but we're also trying to balance how many staff we have versus how many, knowing how many numbers we have at each level. So
There were a couple questions asking about not so much going from distance learning classroom, but the other way, in the opposite direction. So if you start out as being in school and you want to move to distance, that doesn't have the requirement that you stay in the classroom setting until December, does it?
I think, I mean, we want to try to be as accommodating as possible, but we're just trying to plan for resources and staffing. I think, it would be a case-by-case basis, and we've got to make sure that, so if somebody started in person and it was just causing too much, stress or anxiety, then going to remote, we would just need to, look
Make
at
sure
our,
we have
for
the
example, elementary
Mhm.
teachers and make sure that they have room for, another student to go in there, and we try to do that. And then there was another question about if you chose to homeschool, and then they felt like in the second semester of school that if we were in a better place and they could come back to the district, would we allow that? And of course we would allow that. Anything else on distance learning? I mean, Katie, out on page 6, she outlined, the improvements, and that's really coming from that district committee.
Mhm.
I don't know if you guys have questions. I mean, we've reviewed that as a board.
Right. Yeah.
Katie, I don't know if you want to.
No, I just had 2 quick things to add. So under the improvements to distance learning, because we already did a whole presentation on that, you can click on it here. And I just wanted to remind everyone just a little bit about assessment, students being behind, because I know that that's a worry across the whole nation. And one of the things that we spent money on in May was $107,000 of new curriculum and assessment programs with our CARES money, which teachers pre-K to 8 specifically have started to be trained in. There are things like IXL, Lexia, Dreambox, Reading A to Z, all of those things. And the reason why we did that and the reason why teachers started training and we'll have more training in September is because all of those programs are standards based and grade level based. You can have a student take a quick assessment that doesn't need to happen in person. It happens on their own computer. Some are short, some are a little bit longer, but it provides both reports to the student and reports to the teacher about where the student is, and then actually gives them work on their level to try to catch them up. So it kind of, all of those things have the dual purpose that I think will really help not only distance learning, but in-person learning for giving teachers fairly immediate, quick information about where a student is, where they're lacking, providing some support, and then some of them even provide lessons and ideas for how to catch students up. So that I think is great. And then the other thing is, one of the other big themes was just families feeling totally overwhelmed, and teachers as well. And I don't blame them. With so many things to sign into, so many things to keep track of. And so the other purchase that we made was for Brightspace, which is a learning management system, essentially a portal through which you have one username and password and everything will go through there. So grades, any curriculum system a teacher's using, you'll just sign into Brightspace and you'll be able to click on it from there. You'll be able to meet virtually with students through this. And I believe the University of Maine system, it also picked up Brightspace to use for their courses as well, just for the ease of having like a one central sign-in, so it's a much less stressful process to keep track of schedules and assignments and all of those things for families and for teachers.
With everything that goes into this decision, for the family, whether to opt for hybrid or in class or distance learning, I hope we can continue to work with those families who are limited by access to technology.
Oh, thank you. We did purchase hotspots with our CARES money as well for families who have limited connectivity, and Dean and the other tech folks are going to figure out a plan to make sure that those get to the families who need them.
So they're actually for households. They're not like at a park. They're like a hotspot for a household.
Yes, this is not my area of expertise, Damien.
Dean's right here, so
Okay.
Dean is waiting on it.
Dean,
I
can
know
you
there's
talk
some
about
community
hotspots?
spaces too.
Yeah, of course. So there's really 2 different things. One is a hotspot, which is something that a family could sign out for a period of time if they needed it, which would provide them with a cellular data connection in their household. Those are limited, they give you some access. It just is going to depend on how strong your cellular signal is. We still will have some households that live in an area where they simply don't have a good spot for that. I mean, we have some coverage areas in our district where that isn't going to meet their needs. But what we are looking at is extending our Wi-Fi network, strengthening it so that it's outside the building. Also looking at on the Wednesdays, possibly having students be able to access the Wi-Fi in our schools in a controlled environment so that they would still be socially distanced, and looking at, any way that we can to help them to access those materials.
Thanks.
And what portal would parents use now?
Yes, thank you. Everything will mostly go through Brightspace, and there'll be videos that will train parents as well.
So parents would still be able to
Check grades.
check in.
Absolutely.
Because I think that'll be nice to have it in one place, because I know even for me last year, it's like, what am I supposed to be looking at? Google Classroom or Infinite Campus or your classroom's own website? Like, it was a little hard, so that's good to hear.
That's an understatement. Yeah. Hopefully
Steve,
that
would
will
you
all be
like to-
better.
Yep,
4
we should.
minutes, should we make a vote?
Yeah, we should. We have, for the public out there, we have a practice that we do not extend meetings beyond 8 o'clock without affirmative action of the board. So I entertain a motion to extend our meeting beyond 8 o'clock.
Make a motion that we extend our meeting.
I'll second.
So we have a motion by Jen, a second by Lou. All in favor? Opposed? Maybe Dr. Anderson opposed. Are you hostage here? Well, yes, we still have public
I
comment.
have a colleague who's covering me.
Yeah, we have public comment.
I just have kind of a question to throw out there. I would for you now, but with all the planning that is left to do, especially since some of it has to wait until we know more about which students will be coming to school and which will choose distance learning, are we realistic in our expectation to start schools?
I mean, it's a challenge. It's going to be a challenge. I mean, we did push back. You guys approved a modified calendar back in, I don't know, losing track of time. So sometime in June, maybe you did. And so we have those 4 days that, to plan ahead of time. Once this plan's approved, I mean, again, our work just starts really, with all this planning. So I think it's doable. It's going to be, it's going to be busy, but that's all I can offer at this point. Anything else on distance learning that anybody has a specific question on? I'll just go through quickly the busing, cleaning. We've touched on the ventilation piece, but the busing, we've worked with that bus. We're getting estimates on what that extra road would cost if we go in that direction. Again, all students and drivers will wear masks at all times. So not going to be. I don't think any of us here would say that a bus driver, their job is to get the kids to school safely and home safely. Obviously, they deal with behavior on the buses and other things, but to monitor every face mask, I just, it's an expectation. I just want to be clear on that. 1 seat at a time. Windows will be kept open. Hopefully, if we're into this in the winter, that will even slightly, promote better ventilation. Sanitizing is in there. School cleaning, this is always a concern. We're always working with Benchmark. We'll have a meeting with them next week to look at how, what we're using for cleaning the building, but also just how often we're cleaning in those high touch areas, bathroom areas. So we have asked them with that additional state money that we have, we feel like this is an area that we need to prioritize. So we have asked for some estimates on additional staff that we need during the day at our schools, so that while students and staff are present, can be wiping down areas digitally. So just so you're aware of that. Ventilation we talked about. And then just the last section, again, we're not trying to be overly cautious, but at the start of the school year, just the meetings and conferences would be held remotely. even contractors that come into our building. We have some work to do at Dyke New. We'll talk to them about, could you come in on Wednesdays? Could you come in after school hours on the weekends to try to get that project done? We've already talked about volunteers and visitors. And again, we put until further notice. I'm sure there's protocols we can come up with that might be able to work there. But just, the things are going to be different. Students entering the buildings and assigned entries, that's going to be toughest at Morse, obviously, the current Morse, because of all the different doors that we have. Student movement will be greatly reduced at a lot of the different levels. Traffic patterns, we did order, I thought, some very well-made and well-done signs that will go on the floor and on the walls at all of our schools to talk about which way traffic goes, stop, social distancing. No large assemblies. Water fountains will be made inoperable, and students will not have access to their lockers. So those are just things that, again, are coming from Department of Education or the CDC. So schools will certainly look different at all levels. So I don't know if the board wants to start to go into the public comment that we received. I'll turn that over to Steve.
Yeah. I would like, my suggestion is that, and I'll throw this out, this is much a question. I think we all read the public comments that came in, and they have, Vida made an effort to summarize them by category. I do want to acknowledge the folks who sent in those comments, and then I would ask that if there's, I felt I started to check off items on the list that were covered in the presentation, and I got through most of them. I will ask the board just to confirm that if you feel there's something that public raised that was not addressed, then let's do that. Then we'll take a break. This has been live streamed. We're affording the opportunity for folks to call in, or actually I don't know how the comments are coming in, but
Just like
by email. Okay. So we may have gathered some additional comments from the public as a result of this discussion, and then we'll have a board discussion on the overall plan. So if that makes sense, it might take us another 15 minutes or so, or 20 minutes, or half an hour before we take a break. It seems a little bit, the flow seems a little bit better. So I do want to, so moving into item 5.0, the public comment, I do want to acknowledge folks that sent in comments, and we appreciate that very much. It's obvious that from the comments, folks were very thoughtful. The comments were very positive, constructive, and helpful, at least to me, to help me focus on those aspects of the plan that required my additional attention as we got into this discussion. So we heard from Jill Sinclair, Shannon Giggy, Linda Stiles, Susan Longo, Sheila and Jason LaMontagne, Sarah DeWilly, Kelly Marshall, Brian and Sarah Kajewski, Terry Schurz, Robin Kiefer, Libby Zipperer, Sophie Swain, Melissa Cole, Kelly James, Aaron Taylor, Cheryl Ritchie, Danielle Wyman, Ken and Amanda Walden, Karen De Silva, Miriam Johnson, Patrick Wright, Evie Jorgensen, Heidi Tucker, Kevin Thorne, Jim James, Errol Reese, Romy Polizio, Catherine Elliott, Isabel Jackson, Beth Emery, and Allison Cosgrove. If I ruined anybody's name, I apologize. So again, back to my question to the board. Again, I felt many of the comments were covered. The questions sent in some cases were extremely detailed, and I'm not sure we're at that level of detail at this point. But I know Patrick has gathered those, and they would add to guidance as serve as guidance as we continue to work through fleshing out the plan. But are there any broad areas of concern raised by the public that you think you want to raise? We need answers on them before we proceed.
I know Anita chimed in on this too, when we got the comments. And I think for me, special ed still is just something, I know everything's a work in progress, and I'm hearing positive things that if we can get pre-K through 5 back, and if the hybrid allows it, getting those special ed services back in with regularity. We had a lot of public comments. We've had some parents extremely dedicated and advocating even at the state level to make sure that as best possible we're able to provide those services. I mean, my last number from all our budget talks was 360 kids identified with the IEPs, and I think that's about 20% of our population. So while we all have to sacrifice during all this, I just hope that we can all continue to make that also a very large focus, understanding everything came to a screeching halt in March, and I get it. So I think for me is just making sure that eventually just keeps getting addressed. And do we have a summer? We had a summer program, right? And how did that work out?
Yeah, I mean, Justin's on the line, and
Oh,
he
that's
could,
right.
he could,
Justin.
touch base on the summer one, but also, some of your thoughts you brought up. Justin, you there?
Yeah, yep. Yeah, we did have a ESY program, extended school year program. We really found that, our teachers meeting with students one-on-one was the best scenario, and we were able to do that with a number of students this summer. So participation was good overall. Students were able to get up to 4 30-minute individual sessions a week to work on reading and math. And also got their related services, speech, OT. Going into the school year, I think, whether we're in the hybrid or full in-person, it will really be beneficial to just make those connections a few times a week in person with students, and that'll help us build on whatever we need to do from, through distance learning for students with IEPs. And as Katie mentioned, we've been discussing and exploring, the opportunities to get certain students who may be more vulnerable or in specific programs into the building as much as possible for in-person instruction.
Okay. Well, that's positive, but it was mostly remote though. I'm sorry, did you say that was mostly remote though this summer?
Yeah, ESY was entirely remote. Yep. But we found that, the individual remote sessions with students were more helpful, especially for the younger students. So we were able to have our ESY teachers develop a schedule where they were able to pull that off.
And hopefully with our new IT support, should we have to do that again, that would improve, because I'm sure there was still some technical difficulties with that.
Yeah, there was some, I think what will also help us is Katie mentioned that some of the programs that were purchased, those are really beneficial for students with IEPs, Lexia, IXL. So those will be other opportunities we can look at expanding upon in the fall.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think special ed is an area that not only a challenge obviously for us, but for every school district. It's been a difficult to get services to those kids. But I agree that we learned a lot with the distance learning experience we had. And I think we were very honest in evaluating that experience. We tried to make improvements. And I think what Jason and Katie indicated is that we will under this plan, we make every effort to get those kids in the school, get those services. Any other of the public comments that you think we need to readdress.
I liked some of the comments on outside learning too. I know Woolwich even has, I think their PTA got them a outdoor classroom, and I really like that. I mean, summer's going to extend at least into September, so I appreciated those comments because I think we are working so hard to make inside so safe. But I really like the idea of the creativity of some outside classroom time as well. And I know there's spaces in each school that we can talk about later that, Morris has that courtyard in the middle that's kind of overgrown, and maybe there's a community that adopts that space and makes it nice for outdoor learning. I mean, there's just so much we can do. And we can find all the reasons why none of this is going to work. But then we can also find a lot of reasons why it could be innovative and actually positive. Wow. It's so important to make decisions on now, not what could be coming, which could come, but just based on now and who we are as a state and what our numbers look like. So I appreciated those comments that we thought a little bit more creatively.
I think, apropos to that, I think you can be assured that wherever we start out this year is not going to be the way we end the year. We're putting a plan in place, but that plan will be under constant review. Whatever the plan is, I'm not by that comment, I don't mean it's this plan. Whatever plan we put in place will be under constant review and constant adjustment to deal with the circumstances that are faced. And your point that we're being asked to act on best information, best advice that we have at this moment. 2 weeks when the state CDC issues its next green, yellow, red light, we could be a red light. We just don't know. It's a very fluid situation. No one needs to hear that. So if there are no other comments, what I suggest then is that we take a break for 10 minutes. Is that okay? You think?
Yeah, I'd say 5 to 10 minutes to use the restrooms.
Okay, we're
Around
going
and
to
then
take a
we'll check
break.
and see if we have any other
And that way the purpose of that is not only to let us stand up, but also to gather those additional comments that have come in as a result of this presentation. And we'll put those on the table, and then we'll settle back for another board discussion. If it seems like we aren't ready to make a decision this evening, if we want to individually think about the information we've received, the input that we've seen from the public, we'll schedule a subsequent meeting to act on this. We should act this week. Patrick has indicated that we need 48 hours. We need to give 48 hours for the next meeting. Yeah, we still have to check it. But for notice. But I think for reasons that Patrick has alluded to, fairness to the community, fairness to staff, and we just have to get this plan, whatever that plan is, we have to get it going. So I am going to ask that we be prepared to take action this week. It could be tonight. If it's not tonight, that we're available to come back in another couple of days for another special meeting. Okay, let's take a break. Thank you.
Yeah,
call us back into session. We got about 7 or 8 comments sent in during the presentation. Public packet through that.
Yeah, I mean, we'll go through and read these. We may not have the answer, and we'll be honest if we don't. But first one came in just asking why and how the proposed gym classes are still scheduled to take place at Morse and other individual schools when social distancing and mask wearing is mandatory for the safety of all staff and students. Again, our thought is PE would happen in a gym situation inside possibly, depending on the number of students we had, and keeping them 6 feet apart. They would be required to wear masks while they're inside. But ideally, we take them outside and be able to do, again, different activities that would not have contact. And so, I don't know if Dr. Hannah or Katie or anybody else wants to add to that, but
That's what we talked about.
sorry, I'm going to go with emails here. I've got to do it quick as I can.
While you look for the next one, do you want me to address some of the ones that we didn't hit on the
No, it's all right.
original?
I'll be quick.
Okay.
Did Dr. Hannah just suggest that standing 3 feet away with someone with COVID-19 would carry no risk?
So what I had said was when the Department of Education had come out with their recommendations for 3 to 6 feet with a mask, not that I'm suggesting you go out and have a COVID party, but 3 to 6 feet with a mask. If you look at the studies that are out there, and they've pooled a bunch of them, if you are 3 feet away from someone with that, your risk, according to the studies that are out there right now, your risk is about 2.6% if you're 3 feet away. If you're 6 feet away, it's about 1.3% risk of becoming infected. So you have a 1.3% risk lower if you're 6 feet as opposed to 3 feet. So I think that's where the Department of Education came out with that 3 to 6 feet. Of course, I think in general, if you are in a high, a high infection rate area, of course, the further away, the better. But our rates here in Maine are very low. I mean, we're at a 1% infectivity rate. I mean, other than Vermont, we're the lowest in the nation. And if you look at our numbers, we're lower than a lot of the European schools were when they opened. So, again, looking at our risk, 3 to 6 feet makes sense to me when I'm looking at the studies and looking at how much disease is in our community. Thank you.
Next one we have is studies have shown that many families don't have a thermometer or many don't know how to properly use them. How does that play into your planning for morning self-checks? I'm just going to read through these. Yes. Can you specifically address the concern of trusting most of the families to perform the morning self-check? This is simply accepted at risk. I don't know if you want to comment on either one of those two.
Well, I think the thermometers is tough. I mean, I do think that people can order them now. I think for a while it was difficult to even find them in the stores. I don't think that's such an issue right now. In terms of addressing cost, which I suspect is probably what they're asking, I'm not aware of a fund that would help to pay for that, but I don't know if that's something that we could do as a school or as a community, or to ask community members if they wanted to donate some that we could give to families in need. I mean, I think that there are creative ways around the thermometer question. The question of trust. We live in Maine and we live in this community for a reason, and we trust our neighbors. I am not from here originally, but I would never want to leave here. I do trust my neighbors, and yes, are there going to be people who could potentially send their kids in? Absolutely, that can happen in any community, but I think we are a very close-knit community, and our risk of that, I do feel, is lower than if you're in a big city and trusting people.
I would add, I mean, I think part of that is, as you said before, was it only 50% of people actually get a temperature, or students? And so even if everybody did have a thermometer, that's not assuring necessarily anything at 100%. And I think the other thing that We also need to trust how great our teachers and our staff are at knowing students well and knowing when they don't seem well. And while that's not the original safeguard of not allowing someone who's sick through the door, within hopefully 15 minutes of talking to a student, if you know what they're normally like, you can tell when a student doesn't feel well. And our nurses are putting together a protocol along with Dr. Hannah of, should you notice these things about a student and the parent missed it for whatever reason, whether they were, working and couldn't do the self-check in the morning, then this is what you're going to need to do to get that student the support they need and get them potentially home. So I think we also need to trust that as another layer of the system.
Just some are comments, some are questions, but I don't see how you can have mask breaks in a full classroom. Please look more into the use of that much hand sanitizer. There are studies stating that it's negative effects. There are negative effects. Also, if a child has a cut on their hand, the hand sanitizer is going to be very painful to the cut. How updated will parents be on potential cases? As I know, sometimes it takes a couple of days to get COVID results. Will parents be in the loop about potential cases or just when they get the COVID test results? Dr. Hannah said at risk is 6 feet for more than 15 minutes. Your plan for elementary kids is for them to only have 3 feet in the classroom. This is very concerning. 3 feet is with masks. Kids will touch their masks frequently and not always have them on properly.
Yeah, so again, it goes back kind of to those numbers, that the CDC is putting out, they have to give you some number that you have to consider as risk, and whether that's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 3 feet, 6 feet. I mean, you have to mark those boundaries at some point. And yes, so if kids are 3 feet apart, 2.3, based on, studies, again, this is a virus that we've known about, since December. But based on the studies that they've looked at, your risk is still really quite low. And that's looking at it unmasked. So you add a mask to that layer, that decreases your risk significantly more. Going back to the touching of the mask, again, we're going to be having kids clean their hands frequently, either with hand sanitizer or with washing. But even if they are touching their mask, they're probably for the most part leaving it in place. I have to say, in my office, kids come in and we require them to wear masks, and I think everybody would be very surprised at the way kids tolerate it. I have parents who are pulling off their masks more and fiddling with their masks more than the kids do, including very young kids with autism who sit comfortably with the mask on. And I'm not saying every child's going to be able to do that, but having seen many, many, many kids since all of this started wearing masks and tolerating it and doing beautifully with it, I think if we all kind of lead by example and we go into it with more of a positive, this is the way it's going to be, and there are ways to make it fun and make it seem more like, hey, you're doing this to protect others, or make them the enforcers on it. There are ways to make kids really invested in using masks and not afraid to use them.
And then the last comment just was that in favor of hybrid at the elementary level. The next one is thank you for your work outlining the policy aspects, which presumably prepares for the fourth part actual implementation. In order to be able to decide by August 17th, please address the following. Overall, I'm nervous about how official policy will translate into actual implementation by the diverse people on the front lines, typically with respect to complicated pieces like consistent mask wearing and student emotional health. I'd like success to be defined by student and staff engagement and safety, not by sense of policy compliance with DOE. You make some statement or intent of commitment about this. Therefore, can you move quickly to figure out some of the critical implementation details like school board member Ryan asked about, rather than just saying the plan will come later? For some of us, your actual plan with implementation details is more important than the background policy. Also, why did I say that if a student or adult is not complying with a mask wearing, then maybe they will be removed through remote work and we'll have to look at other options? Is there a reason why it isn't just absolutely immediately be removed? I'll comment on the last one again. To be clear, clearer on that is if someone is not wearing a mask, is to find out why first, and then is it a face shield that could accommodate that student or that staff member? If that's not going to work for them and it's some other reason it's just not going to work, then that they would be removed from remote learning or not be in session, either one. So I just want to clarify that piece. Any comments or questions regarding that? I think it's more about the implementation and having having details as soon as this plan is approved, and we are working on those details. But other questions or comments on this email?
Do you think that we would have, I mean, I know the committees and your staff will continue working on the details, but, and I'm sure you'll get to this, but what happens next tonight? Like, is there like a timeline that we might be privy to on, okay, we're gonna tackle this topic here, and then by the date here, and just, not to micromanage, but just as stuff gets released by principals or whatever, so we kind of have a heads up on.
Yeah, no, we've already started to create a schedule, and
Okay.
we'll share that with the board and with the public. And again, we just need to prioritize in that K-5 option, or if something going to change with 612, but that K-5 option, which way it's going to go, kind of dictates some of the things that we're going to do and what the priority is.
Yeah.
Next one was, thank you for letting us view this meeting online. I feel like my questions have all been answered to the best of your ability. So feel free to fill mine out in order to answer others.
I think the key to this, again, regardless of what plan is finally adopted, is going to be communication.
Yeah.
And I did acknowledge in response to some of the folks who wrote in that maybe that's an area that we as a board, as a district, need to improve as much as anything. We are doing the work. I don't think it's reasonable to have an expectation that you have that layer of detail that folks are looking for at this point, in broad framework within which to load that detail. That makes perfect sense to me. It wouldn't be my expectation to have Katie or Dr. Hannah or Patrick to sit up here tonight, tell us in a A through Z format what is going to happen to a student when they walk through the door at Woolwich or Dyton or wherever. But as soon as we have that detail, and as we develop that detail, and as we approach the start of school, or actually even as we approach August 17th, when parents are going to be asked to make a decision, we have to be sure that we communicate effectively with those parents, with the community, as to what our school year is going to look like. That's what we can do. Are people going to be anxious? Yes, people are going to be anxious. We can't control that. We can't control what goes on in the school to a certain extent. That's where we should focus. We'll communicate what we're doing. If people think it's good enough, they'll decide to send their kids back because they think that the plan is lacking in some ways in terms of ensuring the safety of their kids in class. They'll opt for distance learning. But we've got to communicate. We've got to communicate that.
Next comment question is, are you sure there will be sufficient substitutes in place to have school in person? Legitimate question. We're always at a shortage of subs. Again, with some of the money, we'll be hiring some additional support staff. Aren't we setting students and teachers up for failure by starting in person and knowing it's almost certain that someone will test positive, thus causing school to close for 2 weeks? That kind of disruption to both parties will be chaotic, unproductive, and traumatic. Teachers could create great online programming if given enough time to create such plans. Next one is, will parents whose children have difficulty wearing masks due to breathing issues or behavior be able to choose a shield for their child, or will that require a doctor signing off on that coverage? It says right in the DOE requirements that they can, they have that option. I don't know that we would, for me, the importance is to have, covering of the face. So I don't think we need a doctor's note in a case like that. My concern is that I'm a single mother and cannot do hybrid learning. So this worries me that my child will miss out on half of her education. Another thing, also bringing up the single mom piece again, I always drop my daughter off at 8:15 when doors open and head to work. I only have so much flexibility. I work for the state and cover 3 jails with a 15-minute to an hour and a half radius. With this being said, the morning drop-off times concern me with my work schedule and being the only income in my household. Also, my child is transitioning from 2nd to 3rd grade. This is a new school for her, and she's never been there before and is nervous. What are the plans for these children who have no idea where they're going or who to see, and also for parents who've never been to school? So I thank you for all these emails. One question that did come in that like I read on Friday that really kind of caught me off guard, which it shouldn't have, but just like this was, my kids come into kindergarten for the first time, and you're telling me that, or can I walk my child down to class? Similar to 3rd grade, but kindergarten, I think we have kids who've all remember, either putting the kid on the bus or walking into that classroom. So, Katie and I talked, and we're going to talk with our elementary principals, but is there a way to make that work for the kindergarten especially, or what accommodations can we make to make that safe, where they can come in and be able to do that in some fashion? I don't have the answer right now, but we're certainly open to trying to be as sensitive and understanding that as we can.
I think a lot, just if I could add, I think some of that comment and some of these other questions that we received last week go to flexibility, our flexibility with understanding family circumstance. And I would say almost all of these, including this one, if a family has a request that helps them that we can accommodate, then we absolutely will. So if the only time you can drop off is 8:15 and we can make that work for you, then we absolutely will try our best to do it. If you have a student, some of these are about, a student who might not want, who gets anxious when their face is shown on the screen, can they do their learning with the camera turned off and just listen? Of course. And so I would say, all of us will have to learn a great deal of patience and flexibility. And I think that's what we did really well this spring. Not everything, but that was one thing we really tried to accommodate people. And that continues to be one of our goals now.
Next one is, hi, are there specific circumstances that would allow students, staff, faculty, or visitors to be exempt from mask requirement while in school buildings? For example, if a student had asthma or parent claims that wearing a mask or shield could affect their health, would they be allowed to attend in-person instruction or have to participate in full remote option only? So again, that goes back to that same question that you have a way in. But again, I know that all schools are in the same position right now. Going back to what Mona said earlier, is trying to come up with something that really should be consistent amongst all the districts to talk about the face mask issue, so that it's very clear for parents so they know what can be done and what can't. I think this is the last one, and this is a good question. We've talked about this, and we've talked about it with you as well, but self-scanning questions include, have you been outside of the state? How does that affect returning to school? Labor Day is a big summer vacation for travel. So again, that's another thing we've talked about, it which states, getting it out there, it can change, but which states can people go to at the beginning? Because we have staff that have already asked the question because they're taking their student to college for the first time. What states can they go to and come back and not have to be quarantined or have a test of depends on where they're going. So maybe you want to add on that one.
Right. Yeah. I think, again, as we're coming up with these questions, I think what the Department of Education gave is a place for us to start. I do agree with the comments that there is more that needs to be added to that, and for that to be a more thorough tool to protect our kids. And one of those is travel. And as you know, that the statewide recommendations for quarantine, they change on a regular basis. So that's something that we just need to keep track of.
So that's the last of the comments, for tonight. I'll turn it back over to Steve.
Okay, why don't we start the board discussion on it? We'll see how we feel, deciding, taking a vote tonight. I mean, I want everyone to be comfortable in taking that vote, I'm not saying we need to get everyone to vote in one way, but I want you to be comfortable in making the decision whether to support or not to support the plan. So why don't we look at the plan in its totality?
I have a clarification question. If you were to, you said if we went with the intent of pre-K to 5, 100%, that you might ease into it. What is that? What would that look like?
I think,
It's just another option to consider for the board.
yeah,
Whether they, again, whether they feel like, whether you feel like it's, from a timing standpoint and from what you feel from what we presented and also the comments that we've heard, whether pre-K to 5 should be start hybrid for a period of time and to be either revisited or just setting a time and saying as of a certain date that it will go 100%. If nothing health-wise, statistics change. Some districts are, they've talked about that as well.
Yeah,
So,
I guess I'm asking if it's something that, if you're hearing from staff, that would make it simpler for them to get things going, I
think it would make it more manageable with less kids around.
right.
That's the positive piece. I think, and again, I'm not teaching, but I would think that if I were in that role, I guess the downfall of that would be that I've got to do the remote learning, and if I'm only and I've got to prepare for that, then if I go to the remote learning piece and say the board says October 1st or say it's November 1st, then I'm doing remote learning and putting time and effort into that for a month or for 2 months. I don't know if you have the other take on that.
no, I think it would either need to be a shorter amount of time without remote learning as part of it, where it's 3 weeks, let's say, where students are coming in, again, based on the sibling hybrid model, so it's easiest for families, and teachers are not responsible for the remote learning piece then, but it is going to be a very significant difference teaching all the procedures to a first grader than it is to Tanner, for instance. And so that will take, as it is, most elementary teachers take a month to teach all of the systems and routines and whatnot. The first 6 weeks. And so I think it would either need to be, I would advocate either for, us doing a longer period of time, like 2 months, and having distance learning be part of it, or having 3 weeks and just doing in person for the little guys, having it really refocused on fine-tuning procedures and whatnot related to this, because it would be way too much for a teacher at that level to have to plan an entire distance learning procedures communication to then just be going to 5 days a week.
No, I was thinking more that it's more logistics.
Yeah.
And that it's maybe easier to get kids acclimated if they don't have the full group. That's why I was like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
In a short period of time, which, while inconvenient certainly for families, they're already doing whatever they're doing for the summer. It would be a small extension before then it's 100%. If that's a better way to do it. I don't know if that's better than just they all start showing, and just even when Anita said, about are we say, okay, go with something. The last thing we want is, okay, now we have to have everything ready for September 8th, and if it's not, so it's either start school a week later or do this for a couple of weeks. I'm just trying to get it so it's the anxiety is less, there's less stress for staff as well as families in doing this, and whatever that looks like, I don't know what the right, it's
Well, whatever we do, I mean, for families, it should be date certain, yeah. I mean, if we're gonna do it for 3 weeks, we should say that.
No, it is. I mean, whatever we decide, yes, I'm just saying, I'm just looking at is this something that makes sense, or do you, you know, I would not advocate, I personally would not advocate, well, let's start with the hybrid model in the elementary school, do all this distance learning, and then, I'm gonna switch it over in November. That doesn't make sense to me. Either you stick with it for the semester, or you just say, we're going with the 100%. I mean, I'm leaning more toward 100%. I'm just thinking, you know, do we need an extra week? Do we need an extra couple weeks to situate, to start? I don't know. That's what I'm asking.
I would agree with you, Lou, that it's, it doesn't make sense to try to do distance learning and classroom learning. I agree with that. I agree that we could also, could we say we would like Katie and Patrick to get feedback from teachers, from K-5 teachers, and say, how would a easing back into a model work? You know, in terms of the specific, is it X amount of days, or what days it is? So I mean, we could ask them to look at that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that would mean,
And-
that would mean that if, as a board, we said the intent is to go with 100% pre-K to 5, but tell us how you would initiate it, and what's the right way to do it to you know, ease the anxiety and, I don't know, framing that correctly, but that's.
Well, we did get several comments. We said that indicating that starting off, it does create, it's a new routine.
Right.
New for the kids, new for the teachers, new, cleaning, busing. There are a lot of moving parts here. And it does make sense to create a little bit of slack in the schedule. So if it's a ramp up of 2 weeks before we actually launch, that certainly makes sense. I just I think for the sanity of families, you need to say.
Well, yeah, no, you have to
it's
say
gonna
what
be
that
2
date
weeks.
is, right? It's 2 weeks.
We're
or
starting
3
school
weeks.
on the 8th, but for 2 weeks, your kids will come only.
Steve, do we have to decide that tonight, or do we have to decide
No, I don't
that?
think we have to decide that, because they don't think they know for sure. I think what we have to decide, what we have to
recommend.
decide tonight is, are we ready to vote on a plan? Then I'm just saying,
Well,
if that plan has.
We don't have to decide, but we're exploring it because I think a lot of people reacted
Right.
to the start. So I think
I'm just
it's
asking
a
because
useful discussion.
as part of my decision making is, I would lean more toward saying, yes, I think we should try the 100%, given the emphasis on mask breaks outside. It's a shorter day, all these other things.
Mhm.
But I'm only comfortable doing that if we can somehow ease into it. Because if that's part of how we do that, I think that may go over with all, because then people will get a chance to see what it's like, see what it feels.
I agree with you.
Exactly, you just said it exactly how I would say it.
Yeah.
But I would be comfortable at this point with 100%. 5, have a period where they ease in for those first 2 to 3 weeks, but we don't, of course, know. And I don't think we have to, like you said, but that would make me comfortable with that. And I definitely agree that a hybrid easing in would not. It would be more of a situation. Have to go to school this week, have to this week, just.
We haven't surveyed the elementary teachers, but I can almost assure you that nobody will disagree with this idea, that this would be very helpful both for the students and for them. So.
What would that do, and I know Tim's on, would that upset food service too much? I mean, it probably wouldn't, because if you know the 2 days, then you know the numbers. Like, it wouldn't feel that wishy-washy.
We need to say this, what we're gonna do with high school.
Right.
We've got some details to work out as far as
Right.
really offered deliveries from students that are not, or a place where people can pick up if they're not in school that day. We've got to work that kind of stuff out. But as far as schedule goes, it would be much different than 6 through 12.
What about the days they're not there?
That's what I'm saying. That's the stuff that we have to work out.
Oh, I'm
as far as-
sorry, I meant,
Yeah,
I'm thinking ahead of myself.
whether we be
Sorry.
doing deliveries or whether we
Yep.
have a place where they can come pick it up at a location.
Sorry, I,
Yep.
okay.
What do we think of the K through 12? I mean, excuse me,
6 through
6 through 12. Hybrid. Seems to be a lot less controversial.
Yeah,
It's our best option for right now.
I think my only thoughts were just, again, not losing sight of the special ed services, and then I was just curious about vocational, but I had forgotten about the partnerships and the logistics of that. But those were really my two major concerns or questions revolving around that group.
And I know one thing that's been asked a couple times, and I'll just say it quickly, but is, if we're say we're still in hybrid mode at 6 through 12, say through the holiday break, we have had conversations with the city. If our building projects continues to go as scheduled, then, we're planning to move in February. And so for the spring, we would have, 2 high schools or 2 high school spaces. And that would lend itself to have some creative conversation about how we could, if we're still in a hybrid mode, how can we bring more students back because we have more space? We have, it'd be a logistical thing that Eric and Julie would have to work out, but staff. But again, not promising anything, but at least it's an opportunity.
One thing that isn't specifically addressed in the plan for those older kids, but I guess Nate is out there somewhere. There is discussion of beginning sports, ramping sports up fall. And from my perspective at least, if we're going to do sports, we have to give very close attention to other co-curricular activities. I think if I were a parent who had a kid invested in the robotics club, for example, and actually we got one comment, I think, along that, to see approval of a contact sport going on, but school is not supporting robotics. I use that only as an example. And I know Patrick mentioned music. Is there a way that we can get some music programs going that don't involve singing, wind instruments, maybe drumming or something like that? But we need to be I think we need to be sensitive to those kids and those families that are committed to the arts, to the theater, to math club, robotics, and other co-curricular activities that we offer. It would not send a good message, if we start on fall sports and leave those other kids without those important activities to participate in.
So logistically, a lot of this is working out logistically. So when we vote and say, okay, we want plan A, with these details, then everything gets into motion, right? All the other stuff we're talking about as to how it happens, when it happens. Then you start to fill out to the best of your ability the schedule, and everything from what the state allows to what we have say over, and what we have staff for and everything else. And so then, with that meaning, so there's a good chance we would still, I guess we're still scheduled for a board meeting at the end of this month, not before. We have another meeting where we'll be coming back to,
How much approval do you
I
require?
don't know what else we
I think tonight, if you're comfortable, you could give us concept approval that, for our plan, with the caveat of, going back and talking with elementary principals and elementary staff to find, to recommend what that transition or easing in schedule would look like and share that with you. But in general, you could give us concept approval tonight, and then we could, go back and again, share that schedule, share more details as we get it. You know, if we ever have to call another board meeting, we can. We have one on the 24th, and that would be more of a probably updating where we're at. You know, the policy committee, in case we decide to do some actual policies, we would have to, you know, get that together outside of our scheduled meetings. So, yeah.
But for some of the stuff like Steve's saying, you know, other curricular or other things, I mean, is there other stuff that as a board we need to talk about, or is that just, that's not our purview?
I mean, I think that's something that, again, we'll have to have those discussions.
Okay.
And, you know, and again, bring it back to the
Let's
board.
bring it back, update us, and
Yeah.
we can.
All
right.
And again, if the board feels something is, you know, that the board should vote on certain things, then we can certainly discuss it. Again, these are unique times that we're in right now. So, but as far as the details, again, we would be talking with a lot of other schools, right? We want to be the same, but for example, middle school versus high school, extracurricular. Is that a priority right out of the gate, or does our focus really need to be on, you know, getting kids to school and safely and making sure we're doing the academics, you know, safely, and feeding the students and getting the social emotional, and then maybe start up, as an example, the middle school extracurricular a little bit later on. So it's little things like that that we're just going to map out. But from a big picture, you know, if you guys are comfortable making that motion tonight, that's your call.
And I think the only other thing, and we haven't talked about this, that I can think of now that I'm just thinking of the trainings that need to happen, the systems. I hope that the 4 days will be enough and we can fit it all in. But the only other big schedule shift I could see us potentially maybe coming back to with, I don't know yet. Again, we have so many details to work out, is would we potentially, like some districts have done, need more staff days before kids come back? And obviously we want to get kids back sooner rather than later, but not without all the plans
See, but I
in
see
place.
that as part of the bigger picture of
Yeah.
easing into it.
Right.
Easing into it means you're starting 3 days later with the kids, then you're starting 3 days later with the kids.
Right.
I mean, that's like Dr. said, it's unique time, so doesn't, you know, we don't start on the 8th, okay, you know, that's, and that, we want everyone to be prepared when we send the kids to school, so, you know, that's part of what you come back to us for. But I think tonight, I don't know about anybody else, but I'd be ready to vote on a conceptual schedule and say, you know, this is the big picture, and then you can come back to us with details that we can change, confirm, do whatever we need to do. So that's right.
Jennifer, how do you?
I'd be willing to second that motion.
Second motion, okay.
I'd be willing to
Make
second
a
that motion that you made.
I mean,
I
I can make a motion if we want. I just usually say it's discussion
Let's
over.
wait,
but-
yeah, let's wait till we go around.
Yeah, I'll make a motion.
Because I really don't, if there are lingering questions, then I want to make sure we're doing.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Jennifer, you're okay moving.
I just wanted to clarify, so if we were looking at a 2-week into, that would mean conceivably the elementary would have 3 days either home or at daycare or whatever, and while we have to look at everything through the lens and discuss for the child, I'm hoping that don't start causing like more worry about, will daycare take kids just for 2 weeks for those 3 days? I mean, I don't want to get in the weeds, but
Sure.
I'm just making sure that we're trying to do something that eases it and makes it easier for kids too, and teachers. You know, that's really the goal. It's a good thing. But I just want to be mindful of that, you know,
Sure.
that's why the date is important, like after these 2 weeks, full on. And then there was something else quick, it was a date issue. Did I just hear that we might be looking at more staffing days and coming back later? Because I think we need to know that soon too, because parents need to plan. I mean, we've heard that loud and clear on planning when they throw the switch and make their arrangements for whatever, for going back to work. So did I hear that right, or was that just an idea?
A possibility.
You know, I mean, when we look at our we asked you for a more staff development days to give us more time. We just plan things out, and again, we wouldn't wait till the last minute to do that. We may not need it, but maybe just throw it out there as a suggestion, idea. We want to make sure we do it right.
Yep. I mean, I think one of the biggest next steps would, again, us be presenting a calendar to you guys based on the next, data collection and figuring out the timeline of what we can be able to get done by when. And so we would need to give that information to families in order for them to make those decisions. So again, I think hoping that the August 17th thing could still, I mean, they're going to need all those dates before they make a decision. So.
No, exactly, and I think, when I came in here, I was hoping to have some things. I know the staffing can't really be figured out until we have a plan, and I know we don't know the families that are coming back until the 17th. But I would really appreciate, as a board, that we have, when that information starts rolling in, that we start knowing about it. And if it means you have a calendar on when those dates are coming up, that would be really helpful. And then the only other thing is, I would vote tonight, but I know we've talked about subcommittees in the past, this whole communication piece with the community and those partnerships is going to take, I don't know if we can, I'd even volunteer it if we could have a group that kind of works in getting the communication out in a consistent way. That would be something I think that would be helpful. I think you guys are going to need help. On getting it out, and maybe you disagree, but to me, it would seem like have one go-to on getting the information out that could be helpful. It's just an idea.
You're ready.
Yeah.
Okay, any other comments, discussion? We haven't asked Tina for this.
I am focused still, but I like just on the the hybrid learning for 6 through 12, or just for high school. That's the only for that. I think I like it. I don't think it's too much, but I think it's a good way to. I mean, I miss my teachers. I miss seeing people that I don't see day to day, fellow classmates and people who I wouldn't normally be seeing. It's just, I think that's a good way to see it, to bring normality back to the students on the side.
Okay, so I think Bill is not here, but knowing Bill, as soon as I do, he would want to make a decision. And I'm not going to guess how he would decide, but I know he would want to make a decision. And the advantage, obviously, of doing it tonight is that it gives Katie and Patrick 2 or 3 extra days to launch into the process. We are essentially approving a plan. We are a policy group. We're not administrators. We've got to depend on Patrick and Katie to put that plan, to build the plan, put in place. We'll know what that detail is when they develop. Just would reiterate, communicating on that constant communication with the public will help it all go much.
Can I ask one more question? Can I just ask one more question? So on policy, so just so I understand, so as we start fleshing out details, could we not be involved with helping with the policy relating to compliance on what we were talking about earlier, like those guidelines on what happens if we get non-compliance, or what is the framework on deciding what happens?
Well, I don't know what you mean by help.
Well, we have discipline policies and we have behavior policies. And so do we need to tweak those policies to make it more clear? That's what I was going back to the beginning. Like, once we're done here, I agree, we're not administrative, but we have policies that we create that provide the framework for teachers and administrative staff carry out the plan. So if we don't, we don't, but I mean, there's a lot of concern from all the staff surveys and even parents on what are you gonna do when you're faced with all these issues with enforcement? So, you know,
I
just,
think we rely, I mean, main school management, we would rely on them, to rely on, you know, our attorneys to recommend whether we have a policy or not. If we do, then they would go through the policy committee, which, you know, is made up of board members and public, and then it would come to this, you know, back to the board for a first and second reading. But I mean, as far as timing goes, I mean, we would have a protocol or an expectation that we would share with the board. But if we want to make it, you know, a policy, then again, it would go through our policy, our board policy committee.
I'm just, what is the mechanism for enforcement? Is it school by school, or is it something you guys lay out to give to the school? I mean,
Yeah,
I feel like I'm being confusing.
If we have a
Are you just
procedure
talking
for-
about masks?
Yeah, if you're talking about mask enforcement, if we have a policy and procedure as a district, then it's consistent, you know, enforced consistently across the district by each administrator.
And remind me who decides what that framework is on.
If it's a policy, it would go through the policy committee, the board would
Right.
vote on it. If it's just a procedure, then it would be done administratively.
I mean, my
Procedures are
sense
how
is
the
that,
policies are.
yeah, my sense is we would have a policy, you know, if it's our policy to dismiss a student or not to allow a student to attend class if he or she doesn't have a mask. That's the policy. How that is operational, whether the message is carried by the principal or by the dean students or whether the or whether by an individual teacher. I mean, I think that becomes the procedure, and I think we have to, not in my mind, we have to leave that up to the actor of
And as Patrick said, we wouldn't be deciding it as a district in a bubble, because it's gonna be everybody who's having to deal with this, because it is a state guideline. And so it would be, you know, we get most of our policies, as you guys know, that are recommended
No,
to
you're right.
us. And then we would also speak with our lawyers, as he said. So hopefully it would just be us, you know, deciding what we think is best, but it would be with a lot of guidance from other people who have thought it through legally and whatnot.
Just gonna make a motion.
Anyone want to make a motion?
I'll make a motion. So that administration has optimum time to work out the details and get back to us. I would like to move that we accept the plan that ultimately has pre-K to 5 going 100% with feed schedules and 6 to 12 in the hybrid, and certainly in distance learning for those who use distance learning as it's been presented. And giving administration come back to us with the plan, how it will be implemented and eased into, so we have proper dates to get to the public in
I hope you did.
Yes, can you repeat that?
I know, it's too complex. but
I'll second
I wanted to
that.
get the details.
I'll second it, but Lou, could I offer a friendly amendment just to say with the understanding that there will be discussion about easing back in?
Yeah.
I think.
I think
Did
I
you
said
say
that.
that?
Yeah, I said something like that. So yeah,
Somewhere in there. I think
somewhere in
we
that
said-
long,
we
it's
said-
Okay.
ridiculous.
All right, then I second it.
So we have a motion by Lou, second by Jan. Any discussion?
So we're accepting the plan, but allowing administration to decide if an easing in process over 2 weeks would be beneficial.
Well, but I'm not putting the time with whatever that, they need to come back to us. I mean, we're giving them, this is in concept. This is what we want to do. But they need to come back to us to say what date they want to start on, how this is going to work. And that's why I'm saying when we come back, you know, things could change. We come back and say we need to change everything, but I don't want them to have to wait. I want them to get go in that direction. And if that direction needs to change, we can always come back and vote something. That's why I felt it was important to do today.
So we're voting on the plan.
Yes.
I don't know if the delay, the delay is going to ease our ability to accept, to implement the plan. Is sort of the way I look at it.
And they may come back
It's
and
not-
say, we're good on the 8th, and this is how we're gonna do it. You just gotta give them some time to figure it out.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstentions? No. Okay. Yeah.
I did.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. This was a long meeting, but I thought it productive. Move on to the next phase. I guess, right? We have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. Motion by Lou, second by Ron. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wish I had something to wipe them down with.
So